Welcome back, everyone. I'll wait a few more moments. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. It looks like everyone is connected. Good afternoon. We're reconvening after lunch. It is the fourth day of phase 3 of the hearing, and it is, let's see, September 14th at 1:06. This is the court reference proceeding in the case of City of Marina versus RMC Lonestar, Monterey County Superior Court, case number 20CV001387. Where we left things before we broke for lunch, we had CalAm had offered their exhibits to be accepted into evidence. I heard objections. There was a hearsay objection to certain of those exhibits, and also an objection to slides, specifically slides 43 and 44 of exhibit 192. What I'd like to do at this time is accept CalAm's exhibits into evidence, into the evidentiary record with certain caveats. One is that Ms. Meisenheimer's objection to the hearsay objection based on Government Code 11513 is noted with respect to CalAm exhibit 181, 189, and 193. So those hearsay objections apply there in terms of the exhibits are accepted into evidence, but subject to Government Code 11513. And then I just didn't have time. I had to turn to another matter over the lunch break. So I did not get a chance to look at the rebuttal testimony of Dr. Trudell or Dr. Kincaid to really address the objections to slides 43 and 44 of Mr. Durbin's testimony. What I thought makes sense is, since we're going to hear their rebuttal testimony this afternoon, I would like to just hear that rebuttal testimony and then move forward. So what I would say is that I'm accepting CalAm's exhibit 192 into evidence with the caveat that there's still an outstanding objection to slides 43 and 44, and I will need to address that. I'll probably do it in the morning. And that is my intent. Are there any questions? I was a little bit rambling, but are there any questions about what I just said or did and where we are?
No questions.
Thank you. All right, I think the next step here is that we will turn to, my understanding is that the order of the witnesses, unless something has changed, is that we would hear from Dr. Trudell first. And hear the summary of direct testimony. Does that sound accurate? I'm not sure who's going to lead the way in terms of
that is accurate, and I'll be leading the way with Dr. Trudell.
Great, thanks, Ms. Meisenheimer. Ms. Meisenheimer, then I will ask: Are you prepared? And is Dr. Trudell, to your knowledge, prepared to go forward? Excuse me, with a summary of his direct testimony?
Yes, we are prepared.
Thank you. So I will go ahead and administer the oath. I see you. Good afternoon, Dr. Trudell. How are you?
Good afternoon, Ms. Kinsey.
Would you please raise your right hand? Dr. Trudell, do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. You may proceed with your, I will turn things back to you, Ms. Meisenheimer, to ask the witness to verify his written testimony with the exhibit number, please. And then we will go ahead and pull up the presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Trudell.
Good afternoon.
What I'm going to do to save time is I'll run through all of the exhibit numbers, and then I'll ask you to authenticate them. So we have exhibit 58, which is your direct testimony, exhibit 59, which is your direct figures, exhibit 60, which is your rebuttal testimony, exhibit 61, which is your rebuttal figures, and revised exhibit 67, which is your slide presentation. Do these exhibits accurately reflect your opinions in this matter?
They do.
And so with that, I believe we're ready to proceed. If we can get exhibit It's revised exhibit 67 on the screen. Okay, and so with that, I believe we are ready to proceed. Ms. Kenzie, should Dr. Trudell take it from here?
Yes, please. Please proceed, Dr. Trudell.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kenzie.
And I'm sorry, Dr. Trudell, you may know this, but when you're ready to advance slides, you can just address Ms. Mullen directly and ask her to just move forward.
Of course, yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Kenzie, board staff. My name is Mark Trudell on behalf of the city of Marina, and this is my direct and rebuttal expert testimony for phase 3 of this proceedings. Next slide, please. These are the topics I will be talking about. They map very closely to the issues and questions raised by the AHO in their July 26th order. And so I'll be talking about these. The format of my presentation, it will be direct evidence in the first slide. So that's my evidence and Marina's evidence. And then rebuttal evidence in the subsequent slides that are labeled rebuttal slides. And these are the topics I'll be discussing by topic. Next slide, please. First is a brief description of the solute transport model. There's been quite a bit of confusion, I think, between a steady state and a transient model. So the transport model is based on a calibrated phase 2 MCWD 2023 steady state flow model. Like all the flow models in phase 3, it's a steady state model for flow. That's the foundation for the transport code, which is an MT3D transport model. The transport model is transient. Okay, so the flow field that's developed in the steady state model is passed on to the transport model. And then based on boundary conditions and initial conditions, the concentrations are migrated over time. And so that makes it transient. And that's why we can see concentrations after 5 years, 25 years, or at any point we choose to within the model simulation. But the flow is steady state, transport is transient. Just to clarify that. Next slide, please. Now, this is a rebuttal slide, again, in terms of the steady state flow model, and in particular with respect to recharge. Now, we've heard in the last couple of days this question about the error in recharge in CalAM's 2023 modeling results that are due to what they refer to as an anomalously high estimate of recharge. That to me is just fancy words for saying they're incorrect. Because the first thing they did when they realized the mistake was to correct that in anomalously high incorrect recharge, and then move on with their alternative recharge scenarios, which are called RS. And the important thing here is that, or the first important thing, is that if you look at the last couple of lines of that quote, this change or error in recharge likely affects the estimated groundwater flows from the Perch Mounded Aquifer over the western edge of the FOSVA. Now that's the location where we know that a large portion of that fresh water that's flowing off of the dune sand aquifer is subsequently captured by the slant well system by virtue of flow in the slant wells, flow in the dune sand aquifer towards the slant wells, and also flow in the upper 180-foot aquifer towards the slant wells. So that's another way of saying that this recharge error will likely affect OWP in the slant wells. Next slide, please. So what are the implications of this incorrect recharge value? The CalAM in any steady state model, if you modify the recharge, you need to use a higher hydraulic conductivity to compensate. The two of them are linked. If you have higher recharge, you have to have a higher hydraulic conductivity value to maintain the same calibration and the same match to your target groundwater levels used for calibration. A solution is not unique in steady state, so there's not one correct answer. Any combination of recharge and hydraulic conductivity can lead to an adequate calibration. But because the recharge used in CalAm's 23 flow model is incorrect, as by their own admission, anomalously high, its calibration and K distribution results means those are also incorrect. So therefore, when they make a change in the recharge, well, first of all, it means that their calibrated flow model, the 2023 flow model, is no longer valid because the recharge was changed, but the calibration is for the wrong recharge and wrong K distribution. The follow-on effects of this also influence the transport model results, because the incorrect K values that are now carried on in the flow model, they give incorrect velocity field, and therefore the transport models are incorrect for all the results presented to date, either by virtue of the incorrect flow model solution, which is calibrated to the wrong recharge, or because the transport model was not calibrated with, or the flow model was not recalibrated for the correct recharge values. So my conclusion on those 2 points is that the CalAm 2023 flow model and transport model results are unreliable. Next slide, please. Carrying on with the same theme, again, another rebuttal slide. With respect to the recharge sensitivity runs, as they're called by CalAm, in fact, these RS runs are not a sensitivity analysis, but are in fact a new scenario, an alternative recharge scenario. The methodology for reducing the recharge is not substantiated in the written testimony. We've heard some discussion of it in the last couple of days, but there's a 60% reduction in the dune sand aquifer by virtue of the recharge values now used in the RS runs. Key point here is that when they reduce the recharge, and these are recharge that was reduced by about 18% overall, so it's not a trivial change in recharge, it's a big rate change in recharge. And it undermines the CalAm phase 3 flow and transport model results because the model should have been recalibrated for the new recharge values. The base case results, so that's without the RS scenarios, they're unreliable because they use the wrong recharge to calibrate the model, and they've admitted that in slightly different words. And the RS results are unreliable because the flow model was not recalibrated when they applied their new RS values of recharge. So either way, the results are unreliable. And just a final point, and this has been mentioned in the last few days too, is that a true sensitivity analysis really tests a range of parameter values, typically higher and lower than a base case, and to look at the effect on results. But in over 30 years of groundwater modeling, I've never seen a sensitivity analysis where just one parameter, in this case recharge, was decreased by a single amount of 18 to 21%, depending on the scenario, and then have that be called a sensitivity analysis. Next page, please. Or next slide, rather. So again, just wrapping up this particular topic in this rebuttal slide, these are the calibration statistics for CalAm's 2023 model. The middle column, it's broken down by model layer or aquifer unit. The middle columns are from their calibrated model from June 5th, which is the one using the incorrect recharge values. The calibration is very good because they use PEST under relatively unconstrained conditions and got what I would consider a good calibration for their original model and for the model with the original recharge values. And then for the RS scenario recharge case, again, you can see here, and if we look at the mean residual, that mean residual is pretty easy to understand. If the number is positive, it means that the simulated heads are too low. And if the residual is positive, it means the simulated heads are too high. As you can see here, all the residual means are low, not that low in the original case, but in the RS recharge case, you can see that, for example, in the dune sand aquifer, the mean residual goes from 1.2 feet. So in other words, 1.2 feet too low to 7.91 feet too high, that's a significant or substantial change in error and a significant underestimation of heads, particularly in the dune sand aquifer, and in virtually every single layer and model overall, the residual means are substantially higher with the RS1A recharge scenarios, and that's because they didn't recalibrate the model afterwards, after changing the recharge rates. Next slide, please. We've also heard lots of discussion about initial concentrations. The way a transport model works is that you, on top of the steady state flow field that you inherit from the flow model, you define initial concentrations. In this case, we're modeling TDS as the solute that we're transporting. We define that in every cell in the model, laterally and vertically, every active cell, that is. In our case, we use the 2021 TDS concentration contour maps. We digitized those and then brought them into MT3D. So these are the same contours that we saw earlier. They were developed by EKI. And this, in this case, it's for the upper 180-foot aquifer, excluding the CMAX ponds. If we go to the next slide, please. This is the initial concentration distribution for the same time period, 2021 concentration contours for the lower 180-foot aquifer. And the way we did this, just because there's obviously been different approaches used, we took these contours. Contours are based on TDS concentration data that was not necessarily available publicly. So we took the contours, digitized the contours, brought them and brought those into the transport model on a cell-by-cell basis. So that's how we did that. The contours are based on data, but not all the data is public information. So that's how we did that. And if we go to the next slide, please. One additional aspect of the initial concentrations for the transport model is that we incorporated the CMAX dredge and percolation ponds in our initial concentrations for TDS for the transport model. And the saltwater plume, in addition to the ponds themselves, because the percolation ponds release a significant quantity of water as recharge to the subsurface, there's a saltwater plume from the CMAX ponds that are included. The plume is also included in our initial concentration distribution. So the initial concentrations used by the MCWD Marina model include the impacts from the CMX ponds and plume. The ponds were removed in 2022 and therefore are not used in the forward-looking or predictive simulations. The plume was still present, and so the plume remains for the forward-looking simulations. Next slide, please. So we calibrated our transport model to the test slant well period. It's the 900-day period from October 2015 through to late 2018, or early 2018 rather. And we incorporated the CMX dredge pond, CMX percolation pond, and the initial concentrations and simulated for the test slant well period, the 900-day period, that stretch of simulations going compared to the observed TDS values from the actual pumping slant well pumping test. I just wanted to make one additional comment before we leave this slide. There's been some criticism with respect to boundary conditions that our general head boundaries include 0 concentration values at the general head boundaries. That's largely mainly true. I think there are a couple simulations that have other values, 440, I believe, in some cases. But the bottom line, the important fact there is that really doesn't matter. Those concentration boundaries, first of all, most of those general head boundaries are outflow boundaries. So if the concentrations are leaving the model at that point, it doesn't really matter what the boundary concentrations are. Second of all, any inflow boundaries along the landward side of the model domain are so far away from our area of interest that they would never reach there in any reasonable time frame. And so basically the general head boundaries don't matter. And I'll make one further comment on that topic, and that is we received model results from CalAm, and at least the ones that we were working with in some detail, they're 1A or 1B rather, transport flow and transport results. Their flow model had 0 concentration boundaries for the landward general head boundaries for that particular one. We didn't do an inventory of all the CalAm models to see which had, some of them had 500 milligrams per liter as the inflow boundary concentration. Others had 0. So that's all I can say really about that. But it's not in either case, it's not a really valid complaint because it doesn't affect anything in terms of the results from either the flow or transport model. Next slide, please. So this is another rebuttal slide, and this is respect to the 2023 CalAm model and their transport model calibration or lack thereof. So we have heard that they didn't recalibrate their transport model, and we heard various reasons for why they didn't do that. But what they did do, they relied on their North Marina groundwater model 2022, which had a transport model calibration in it. And they recalibrated that. They did not recalibrate that transport model when they switched to the 2023 steady state model. And they document that in CalAm 141, page 28, where they state quite clearly the ability of the 2022 model to match the observed OWP from the test slant well period was used for solute transport model, used for solute transport modeling. So that their calibrations on has been done. Transport model calibration that they're relying on is from a very different model. It's a transient model. It's got a different hydraulic conductivity distribution, different boundary conditions, different different hydrostratigraphic representation. So it's completely different model, but they're still relying on it as the foundation for their 2022 transport model calibration. And the problem with that is that the groundwater velocity vectors that are passed down from the flow model to the transport model are different between those two model versions. So, with all those differences between the two models, you can't just take make the assumption that if it worked for the 2022 model, it'll work for the 2023 model. So what we did, the Marina team, we checked their calibration of their 2023 transport model to the observed pumping test slant well pumping test data. And to do that, we used, actually, this says 3B RS model. It was the 1B RS model with slant well pumping set to 0, except for the test slant well, which was set to the pumping rate used for the test slant well period. So next slide, please. So this is what the results look like. Everything else was set up the same as for our transport model calibration. So the yellow line is the calibration for the CalAm 2023 transport model. The green line is our calibration for the Marina, MCWD Marina transport model. Again, the blue dots are the observed TDS values. And the only thing that was different was that we used a lower concentration of TDS in the percolation pond from the CMEX site when we did this calibration. So you can see that the model doesn't calibrate particularly well, but that was the result that we obtained from that transport model calibration. If we could go on to the next slide, please.
And Dr. Trudell,
Yes.
I know you're feeling the time pressure to get through this in 45 minutes, but I would encourage you just to speak a little more slowly.
Oh, okay. I will try. We've looked at slides like this a number of times for the last few days. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, except what we're going to look at here are 3 different scenarios in order. the B scenario, which is kind of the baseline case, the C scenario, which is the sigma groundwater extraction scenario, and then scenario D, which is the sigma pumping reduction scenario. The only thing I'd like to point out on this, if you look about, see where the CMEX site is, it's like kind of a blue rectangle about in the middle. To the right of that, there is so the left panel is non-pumping, the right panel is pumping scenario with the project slant well 15.5 MGD. And then the right panel is the difference between the two. In the middle panel, when the slant wells are pumping, you can see immediately east of the CMEX site an embayment of lower concentration TDS water. And that is shown in the shades of green and yellow compared to orange and red, which are the high salinity initial conditions, higher salinity. And then when you look at the difference now, in my interpretation, that represents the slant wells pulling in lower TDS water from the landward side. So it's coming in from the east towards the slant wells pumpings. And that's what you can see also in the right-hand panel. The greens there are reduction in total dissolved solids concentrations. And what CalAm attributes that to the slant wells intercepting seawater that would otherwise intrude it further inland. To me, that doesn't explain why the concentrations would decrease. Might explain if concentrations stayed the same as they were, but it makes a lot more sense to picture this as the concentrations decreased because the fresh landward-based groundwater is being drawn in towards the slant wells. So that's my explanation. And just if you can, before I move on to the next two slides very quickly, is just notice on the right-hand panel, the extent of increased concentrations in this case, the upper 180-foot aquifer for the baseline pumping case. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is also the upper 180-foot aquifer, 25 years of pumping. And what we're seeing, again, focusing, this is for the slide, case number scenario 3C. So this is the groundwater extraction scenario. If you look in the top portion of the right panel, you can see that there's a fairly large area of increasing concentrations where water is being drawn into the extraction wells. Again, still a very large area of increased TDS concentration south of the slant well system. And again, that green embayment of low TDS water that's being drawn into the slant wells from the landward side. And if we go to the next slide, please. So this is the 3D scenario. This is the sigma pumping reduction scenario. And here, what we're looking at is what you can see that in the Monterey subbasin along the coast south of the CMEX site, TDS concentrations are pretty much held to the coastline. And there's very little difference between the pumping and non-pumping scenarios because the sigma pumping reductions are overwhelming changes caused by the slant well pumping system. And the changes that you see are mainly in the vicinity of the CMEX site. Immediately south, immediately north, you see increases in TDS concentrations in the right panel. And again, you still see embayment of fresh water from the landward side going towards the CMEX wells. Next slide, please. This is a rebuttal slide with respect to CalAm's TDS contour maps from their uncalibrated 23 transport model. Because they're using an uncalibrated transport model based on an uncalibrated or unreliable flow model, I consider that their incorrect flow model results and their incorrect transport model results make the resulting flow and transport models unreliable. And so they're incorrect because of those underlying flow model issues used for the transport modeling. Next slide, please. One of the questions we were asked to look at is the fate of induced seawater flows from outside of the capture zone landward-based groundwater basin. And so for that analysis, we took particle tracking results from particles placed along the coast, migrated them over time, just according to whatever gradient was dominant during the movement of those particles. You can see the particles do move landward. One thing this map shows, and I'll show this format in a couple of different ways. The black dot on each particle trace represents 25 years of travel time. So if you connect those dots, you can map out the movement of the advancing seawater over time, or after 25 years, for different locations in the model domain, north and south of the slant well pumping cone or capture zone, which is the green area in the middle of the figure here. So this is for the 3B case. This is the baseline case. Obviously, after 25 years, the particles continue to migrate and move further inland, impacting the. This is the we call this advective transport. So this is the flow of seawater that just flows when it moves in the land, under the land, and migrates with the dominant groundwater flow field at the location where the particles enter the groundwater basin. So if we look at the extent of that yellow patch on this slide, this is for 3B. If we go to the next slide, please. This is 3C. You can see how much bigger that yellow patch is. It's the exact same setup, but now with the extraction well sigma compliance scenario. So you can see where the extraction wells are north of the CMEX site, much more extensive seawater intrusion. It's even worse south of the CMEX site for this particular scenario. And if we go to the next slide, please. This is the 3D sigma compliance pumping reduction scenario. You can see how much narrower that band of seawater intrusion is by virtue of advection. That's because there's a much flatter gradient when you do that magnitude of pumping reduction in this basin, 30 to 50% in general and in selected areas. The seawater intrusion front as mapped by the advective front after 25 years is much reduced, both north and south of the CMEX site compared to the baseline case. So if we'd have the next slide, please. So CalAM's particle, this is a rebuttal slide with respect to CalAM's particle tracking of inflows from the coastline. Again, we don't think their results are reliable because their flow model and transport, or their flow model in this case, is incorrect. The baseline case is incorrect, and the RS scenario case hasn't been recalibrated. So changing recharge alone without model calibration and adjustment of K is not the correct way to implement a change in recharge. So said that before, just say that one more time. Next slide, please. So if we looked at the effect of the induced seawater inflows on beneficial uses, that's the next topic and the next question in the AHO list of issues, effect on beneficial uses. One way to look at that is in terms of ocean water percentage. So the results from the MCWD model for the three different scenarios, B scenario, C scenario, and D scenario, are in the left columns. And you can see the average slant well OWP there in the bold numbers in the right-hand group of that columns, or the right-hand columns of that group. 88% to 89%, with the lowest being 85% for the 3D scenario, highest being 89.5% for the 3C scenario. The results for the initial CalAM flow model simulations, OWP there ranges from 89.8% to 93.2%, 91.5% for the B scenario. Excuse me. Highest concentration or highest ocean water percentage in the slant wells for the 3C scenario, but all of those OWPs are higher than the OWPs that were calculated using the MCWD model. And then finally, for the RS scenarios, we have the highest OWP of all, which is as you would expect, the reduction in recharge mainly affects the dune sand aquifer. That affects the amount of fresh water that moves from the dune sand aquifer past the aquitard, the SVA aquitard, and then is captured by the slant well system. And so that's why we see these much higher ocean water percentages from 94.6% to 95.8%. Appreciably higher ocean water percentage for the RS scenarios than for either of the two, and in particular with respect to the MCWD ocean water percentages. Next slide, please. Again, looking at this question of the effects of induced seawater inflows on beneficial uses, this is a similar particle tracking mapping as I showed previously. In this case, it's for the 400-foot aquifer, and I chose the 400-foot aquifer here because the blue dots, which are rather hard to see on this figure, are actual regional pumping wells. And most of those are in the 400-foot aquifer. So what you can see here, the pink band is, again, the 25-year advective seawater intrusion front from the particle tracking results. So this doesn't include dispersion, just the advection of the seawater that comes in above, north and south of the CMEX capture zone. And you can see here on a couple different things. Most of these particle traces stop before they reach the edge of the map. That's because that particle is being intercepted by a production well. And so where you see a hook or a loop at the end of the particle trace, that means that that particle has been intercepted by a production well, and you can see that feature in many of those traces. So that means that those wells will eventually be impacted sometime after 25 years. Now, the next slide, please. So again, that was the B scenario. This is the C scenario, the Sigma groundwater extraction scenario. Very large area of seawater intrusion on the north end of the model domain. Somewhat more complex particle path lines. Those particles are all being intercepted along that portion in the northern part of the domain, are being intercepted by production wells or extraction wells. If we go to the next slide, this is the 3D scenario. Again, seawater intrusion front, much more limited because of reduction in the gradient. Particle traces, again, are being intercepted by regional pumping wells for the most part. Next slide, please. So a rebuttal slide on the effects of seawater intrusion inflows on beneficial uses. This is with respect to OWP. It's my opinion that the OWP calculations by CalAm are unreliable because of lack of calibration of both the transport model and the flow model. So they didn't calibrate their transport model. They didn't recalibrate the flow model on the basis of incorrect recharge or change in recharge. Next slide, please. This is another rebuttal slide. This is the effects of seawater inflows on beneficial uses. This is CalAm's figure. And you can see the citation there, CalAm 177, figure 61. Particle traces starting at the coast. This is the 400-foot aquifer and migrating inland. Many of those particle traces are picked up by existing production wells. I circled ones that are obvious in black, but I didn't catch them all. Plus, there are those particle traces, they continue to migrate, eventually will be likely picked up or intercepted by regional pumping wells. The pumping wells in this diagram were added by Marina, just by the way. Next slide, please. The loss of groundwater storage is the next topic. And this is with respect to two aspects. We looked at drawdown in the dune sand aquifer under scenario 3B and calculated the loss of groundwater storage from that drawdown, represented by the drawdown. So the water level goes down in the dune sand aquifer, and there's a storage loss associated with that. Loss of groundwater. It's a cumulative loss, so it's 1,500 to 2,046 acre feet in total. That's from the MCWD Marina calculations. But a secondary aspect of this drawdown is that there's a reduction in recharge from the dune sand aquifer. It results because there's reduced saturated thickness in the dune sand aquifer. There's a decrease in vertical gradient. And so there's a reduction of groundwater recharge to replenish the deeper aquifers. This reduction in the dune sand aquifer outflow is primarily vertical, but it's not captured by the slant wells. That's just a reduction in groundwater resources and storage overall in the groundwater basin. Next slide, please. This is a rebuttal slide on the loss of groundwater storage. CalAm predicts decreases in groundwater storage. They're using a similar method to ours, just looking at the loss of storage caused by groundwater drawdown. But in their case, in the dune sand aquifer only, and that's drawdown is caused by project pumping, but their results are about 10 to 15% lower than the ones that we predicted using the MCWD model. And a large part of that difference is because CalAm improperly subtracts the portion of dune sand aquifer water in the drawdown area that has a greater than 1,000 milligrams per liter TDS. It appears that they don't think that groundwater has any value, so they think a loss of that groundwater from storage is inconsequential. We disagree. We think that's an important groundwater resource, should be accounted for, and is accounted for in our analysis. So although they did consider the loss of storage due to drawdown, they did not evaluate their calculations in terms of the other aspects, reduction in overall recharge downward to deeper aquifers. And of course, because of the underlying problems with their groundwater flow models, we don't think even their drawdown results are questionable. Next slide, please. This is a new topic now, the flow of fresh water from the dune sand aquifer into the upper 180-foot aquifer. This is one of the questions asked by the AHO with respect to MCWD 160 slide 9. This is a conceptual representation in the Monterey subbasin of groundwater flow in the vicinity of the coast and a conceptual interpretation of westward flow in the dune sand aquifer, which is the source of groundwater recharge, until it reaches the western limit of the FOSVA aquitard, which is the brown lens shown in the middle of the blue patch on this slide. And then that groundwater flow, when it reaches the edge there, it's now interconnected to the upper 180-foot aquifer, which has a landward or an eastward flow direction. And so that flow from the dune sand aquifer moves downward and then reverses direction and starts to move eastward in the upper 180-foot aquifer. That reversal of flow is sometimes called the U-turn, but you can see the pattern there. Now, this does not go through the CMEX site or near the slant wells, but it's a conceptual representation only from the Monterey subbasin. So we decided to look at this in terms of our, next slide, please, in terms of our transport model results to see if the model also supports that, the numerical model, the transport model supports that conceptual model. You can see the arrows this is the non-pumping case, scenario B, after 25 years of transport. You can see the arrows in the dune sand aquifer going from right to left and starting in the upper right. You see the arrows pointing to the west in the dune sand aquifer. They reach the edge of the FOSVA. It's a little bit hard to see because the water in the FOSVA is the same quality as the dune sand aquifer, so it's the same shade of blue. But you can see just west of well MW7, between MW7 and MW4, you can see that the arrows change direction from westward or from right to left to downward. and then reverse flow when they get to the upper 180-foot aquifer and flow eastward. So it's virtually the identical pattern that was shown in the conceptual model slide number 9 from the previous slide that was shown. And then you can see to the west of there, from the CMEX site, there's flow of predominantly saline water towards the east, and then it ultimately some of that will move downward into the upper 180 as well. But all the flow beneath the CMEX site, besides being very saline water to begin with, also flows inland. If we look at the next slide, this slide shows, please, the next slide. Thank you. This slide shows the pumping case. So this has the CMEX wells pumping 15.5 MGD, 25 years of transport. And you can see some significant changes in flow pattern from the, again, top right corner. You see the flow arrows from heading west in the dune sand aquifer. When they get past MW7, they start to flow downward, and then do the U-turn and start to flow eastward in the upper 180-foot aquifer. But the main difference here is that now that fresh water is also, if you go just left of where those arrows turn downward for the second time, you'll see that the fresh water from the dune sand aquifer and fresh water from the upper 180-foot aquifer is now being drawn towards the slant wells. It's what you would expect, because the slant wells produce a significant cone of depression. They have a relatively large capture zone. They capture water that's in the dune sand aquifer, the upper 180, and that flow now goes towards the, even some in the lower 180 goes towards the slant well pumping system. So the next slide, please. This is a rebuttal slide with respect to flows of fresh water in the dune sand aquifer that we were just discussing. CalAm did their own analysis of this situation too. It's in the CalAm 177 figure 90, and I'll be showing that on the next slide. And it also supports the MCWD 160 slide 9 conceptual model, and it will show it. I'll show you that on the next slide. The results for scenario 1B, the non-pumping case, and compare that to the Marina exhibit 61. Figure 59A, which was our previous slide. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is CalAm's model results. Now their color shading is completely different intervals, and they don't show all of the groundwater flow arrows, but they do show the important flow arrows, and you can see the white arrows there that are in the vicinity of MW7. One important difference between the CalAm model and the MCWD model is the FOSBA, which is shown in green here and blue, stops to the east of MW7D. So you can see that where it's labeled here as the western edge of the FOSBA. As soon as the dune sand aquifer water reaches that point, it starts to flow downward. It flows downward into the upper 180, and then does the U-turn and flows back to the east in the upper 180, and to a lesser extent in the lower 180. It's exactly the same pattern of flow that we show. Different concentration ranges, probably because of differences in their initial conditions. We developed our initial concentrations differently than CalAm, and so that's to be expected that there might be some differences. This is the non-pumping case for the CalAm model, along a very, very similar cross section to the one that I showed for the Marina MCWD model results. Can I have the next slide, please? This is getting to one of the last topics, the spring 2021 real world groundwater level map. This is the question: are that mapping accurate? And what are the implications? Now, this is for the spring 2021 groundwater elevations. What we're seeing here is that the blue blue and yellows are groundwater elevations above sea level. Reds and light and dark reds are groundwater elevations below sea level. You can see that the left panel is the non-pumping condition. The right panel uses that and looks at pumping conditions. And you can see that those heads above sea level protect the inland groundwater from seawater intrusion until you get to the point where the seawater or the groundwater elevations are below sea level, which are the red or shades of red, and that's where we see significant inflow of seawater impacted groundwater further inland. But it's steeply landward behind this, or to the east of that elevated above sea level groundwater mound. If I could look at the next slide, please. So we feel that this is a very accurate representation of the real world heads. CalAm criticizes that this is actually a rebuttal slide, but it's not labeled that. CalAm criticizes Dr. Kincaid's spring 2021 groundwater elevation map. But that map represents the calibration period of the flow model, both theirs and ours. And it's a reasonable representation of current baseline conditions for evaluating the effects of drawdown on the seawater protective elevations, or the seawater protective heads, sometimes they're called. Despite CalAm's criticisms of Dr. Kincaid's groundwater elevation map, they do not suggest an alternative date. They do not provide a baseline groundwater elevation map of their own in their testimony. And they really do not evaluate the effects of drawdown on the seawater protective heads. Instead, they have a very extensive analysis of seawater protective heads in terms of the gradients. So they don't worry about heads, they talk about gradients. But important to note is that the gradients that are discussed in CalAm 179 are not in the direction of flow, and therefore they are not gradients. Hydraulic gradient is by definition in the direction of groundwater flow. We heard Dr. Durbin, or Mr. Durbin, explain how what he has is one component of the groundwater gradient. A normal component to that transect line would be required to establish the actual groundwater gradient. So he started calling them something other than gradients. I think he calls them profiles. But the other factor that I dispute is that in many times the gradients don't consider the mean sea level as a key head in the gradient calculation. We believe it should be, because if you have heads below sea level, you're going to have a component of flow that's inland, which is seawater intrusion along the coast. Excuse me. And so we think that's a significant defect of their model. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, this is the last slide, and it is with respect to the rebuttal exhibits that CalAm submitted in the series of exhibits 183 to 189. And their main complaint with our use of the test slant well period for transport model calibration is that, first of all, they think the 900-day period used for model calibration is too short. That's 2.8 years. That's a pretty long calibration data set, particularly for an active pumping system. I've never seen one longer. So they say that because that's too short a period, it's irrelevant. Now they suggest using an additional period. Our transport calibration period starts in October of 2015. They think we should start at the beginning of the very first pump test in April of 2015 or February of 2015. But what happened there was the slant well pumped for 1.5 months, was shut down for 4.6 months, groundwater system completely recovered. And so then when the pump test restarted in October of 2015, it was under stable conditions, and then the pumping conditions were relatively stable after that. So, we think it's a good data set for calibration purposes. And it's the same data set that CalAm used when they calibrated their 2023 model, or sorry, 2022 model. Now they say it's an irrelevant data set. So I don't quite get the disconnect there. And that's, you can see the citation there for the reference to that 2022 transport model calibration. So I believe that's my last slide. In which case, in which case I'll wrap up by saying thank you for your time. I appreciate being able to present this expert direct and rebuttal testimony to the AHO. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trudell. I know you've been doing this for quite some time, but the question always is, it's that cross-examination that you may not appreciate. You might be so appreciative of your opportunity to be here. But it's been quite polite. And I actually wanted to thank all of you for your professionalism throughout this proceeding. Yeah, I'm new to this, but I really appreciate it, and it's quite helpful. I know there are points of contention, but we've been moving along, in my opinion, quite cooperatively. Dr. Trudell, I had, I think, just two questions for you that came up for me during your presentation that I would like to ask.
Certainly.
At this point, just to make sure, to confirm. One is just to confirm my understanding, and I wanted to refer to, you had a number of slides with particle tracking on them.
Yes.
And I just wanted to confirm my understanding of those. I believe all this, I don't know, do you have off the top of you, any of them would do if we could pull it up, but I don't know, if Ms. Mullen, if you can pull up any one of those slides with particle tracking on them, or if Dr. Trudell, if you have a slide number off the top of your head.
18 to 20 or okay. 23 to 25.
Great.
So this is scenario B. This is slide 18, I believe.
Great. This works just fine. I wanted to confirm. So this is scenario 3B, which is a with pumping. All of the threes are with the slant wells pumping scenario, yes. Right? As I understand. Right. And so in looking at this figure, if the question I'm in my mind is what are the impacts from the slant wells pumping, would I specifically from the pumping itself, I would want to look at this figure, and then wouldn't I want to compare it to, I guess, whatever scenario 1B to understand what the incremental impact from the pumping was? Is that?
Well, yes.
That correctly?
Certainly. Sorry for interrupting. Yes, that's a fair question. But that certainly is the focus of all of CalAm's particle tracking, is comparing non-pumping and pumping situations, because their focus is what is the impact of the slant well pumping system, with or without pumping. What's the impact? We're answering a different question. In these slides, we're answering the question 3A that was raised by the AHO, which is what happens to seawater inflows outside of the capture zone during project pumping. So in order to have a capture zone, you have to have a pumping scenario. You have to have pumping, so that's why we use 3B. And then the point here is to show what happens to the seawater intrusion outside of the capture zone. Where does it go? So this shows where it goes. It shows how bad it is after 25 years, and then continues on after that. But we didn't want to make this too busy by plotting every 25 years or something. So that's why we don't show the pre-pumping case for this slide, because we're answering the question 3A: where does it go, or what happens to the seawater inflows under project pumping conditions?
Okay, I think I understand that, and then that makes sense. But and then I had a follow-up question about, we can take this slide down, Ms. Mullen, thank you. I don't think we need a slide for this one, but we can bring it up. I wanted to just confirm, I know you pointed out a number of times and quite clearly both in your written testimony and here, the disagreements with concerns about CalAm's modeling. On the one hand, there's the concern that they used, as they termed it, anomalously high recharge amounts in one version, and then there's the we're calling it I think the RS scenario. Words are evading me at this point, but we're
recharge sensitivity.
Thank you. The RS, yes, that recharge sensitivity scenario, which you criticized as not being properly recalibrated, given the changes in the recharge amounts. Maybe I'll stop there. Do I understand that correctly so far?
Yes, that's exactly what I said. The point
Right.
I was making. Yep.
Good. Well, I got that. So I wanted to ask, and you may not have an opinion about this, I don't know. Do you disagree with the original recharge amount? Because we also heard kind of through cross-examination some criticism of what I think is going to end up being some criticism of how the new recharge amounts were calculated. But do you have an opinion about whether or not the original recharge amounts were anomalously high or not? Or
Well, I do, and in my previous testimony, I can't remember now. I think it was phase 2. I criticized the recharge. The CalAm recharge was about 35% higher than the recharge that MCWD was using in their model. Both had similar calibration statistics, well, because CalAm calibrated to that recharge, that higher recharge number. We calibrated to a lower recharge number using PES, but with little different constraints. And so the differences in calibration reflect mainly the differences in constraints used in the automated calibration routine called PES. So that's, now I forget your question.
I think my question was whether you, and maybe this answers it, is that whether you had an opinion about whether the recharge amounts used by CalAm initially were in fact anomalously high.
Yes, I did have an opinion on that. It's in my testimony. We felt it was too high, but they didn't explain, how they derived it. Their explanation at the time was they brought in the recharge values from the Tim Durbin regional model and applied those, apparently with some sort of translation error that gave them this incorrect anomalously high recharge. But I had already pointed that out to them previously. I didn't know why, but that certainly it was obviously different by a substantial amount from the MCWD model.
I understand. That makes sense. Thank you. That's helpful. Those were my 2 questions. I'm going to put my team on the spot and ask one of you to come off mute, if you will, and let me know whether anyone else from my team has any questions for Dr. Trudell at this time. I'm putting them on the spot.
I don't have any questions at this moment.
Okay. Ms. Graziano, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have one question, Dr. Trudell. I don't know if I misunderstood you, but did you say you applied TDS concentrations to every modeling cell?
Yes, that's what the transport model does. It calculates concentration for every cell. Now, in some cases, those concentrations are 0. In every active modeling cell, is I believe my exact words, and so it has an initial concentration in every model cell, and then at every time step, it recalibrates that concentration in every model cell.
For your initial concentrations, were there areas where you applied a lower TDS?
So short answer is yes. And how that worked was that from the TDS concentration contours that were the basis of our initial concentrations, we used those contours, interpolated them, put those results into Surfer, ended up with an initial concentration value for every model cell for which we had a TDS contour map. And then for any remaining cells, we applied, for most of the model cells, we applied an initial concentration of 440 milligrams per liter. So that's kind of the ambient background groundwater concentration of TDS. In the deep aquifer, we, I think, used a lower TDS value for our initial concentrations, but there's nothing happening in the deep aquifer. There's no seawater intrusion. The concentrations don't change. CalAm's results show the same thing as ours. I think they used a slightly different concentration for the deep aquifer, but ours was quite low. I don't remember the number exactly. But yes, we do have an initial concentration in every model cell, every active model cell.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Graziano, and thank you, Dr. Trudell. I believe at this point, the thing to do will be, we'll take a short break momentarily, but I don't know if it's Ms. Meisenheimer or Mr. Brochard. I believe our next witness is Ms. Nelson. Is that correct?
Yes, and Ms. Kinsey, I will be
Mr. Wilkins, wherever you are, you're on my screen somewhere. There you are. So Mr. Wilkins presenting Ms. Nelson. And if we take a 10-minute break, would that be, do you think that would be appropriate? And then Ms. Nelson will be ready, you and she will be ready to go?
I'll let Ms. Nelson, let me know if she needs any more time. Ms. Nelson, are you on, you're not on mute. Are you good in 10 minutes?
Yes, I'm good. Thank you.
Great. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We'll return at 2:20 and we'll pick up with Ms. Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. I apologize for that delay. I think we are going to start, Mr. Wilkins, with Ms. Nelson, for whom I need to administer the oath.
Yes.
I see you there, Ms. Nelson. Wonderful.
Yes,
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Will you please, Ms. Nelson, raise your right hand? Ms. Nelson, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I will turn things over to you, Mr. Wilkins.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Nelson. I'm going to follow on the city's example and just list the exhibits that you have submitted for phase 3 and just ask you to verify these are the exhibits and testimony opinions you've offered for phase 3. It's MCWD 163, your direct testimony, 165, your report for phase 3, as well as appendices A through F, 166, appendix G to your report, 168, your rebuttal testimony for phase 3, 171, and October 2022 EKI indirect potable use memo, 172, the 1997 draft final site analysis analytical report for Fort Ord, 173, a 2022 geoscience monitoring network information, 174, an email chain involving yourself, Dr. Ye, and others, and 178 TDS data that you presented. Are those the testimony and documents that you submitted for phase 3 of these proceedings?
Yes.
If we can, Ms. Mullen, please pull up MCWD 175, which is the second revised slides for Ms. Nelson. And Ms. Nelson, if you want to take it away, you can start, I assume, on the second page if you want to advance one slide.
Yes, please. Thank you. I thought I'd just introduce myself briefly. I have several graduate degrees from Stanford University, including a degree of engineer and a Master of Science in Water Resources and Environmental Engineering. As part of my research at Stanford, I conducted several numerical solute transport groundwater modeling work, basically. I'm a professional civil engineer in the state of California. I have over 30 years of experience consulting and managing hydrogeologic studies, conducting groundwater quality assessments and water resource and supply evaluations. I have extensive experience in SGMA. I'm one of the primary authors of the Monterey Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Plan. I'm also one of the primary reviewers for the 180 400-foot aquifer subbasin GS Groundwater Sustainability Plan, to which MCWD is a signatory. Next slide. In my opinion, the MCWD and CalAm flow and transport models show that the project will cause drawdown in multiple aquifers in the vicinity of MCWD's wells and along the coast, a loss in groundwater storage, a reduction in seawater protective heads along the coast, additional seawater intrusion into the Monterey Subbasin, both inside and outside of the slant well capture zones, increases in TDS concentrations in the Monterey Subbasin, increases in the inland extent of the seawater intrusion front, particularly in the upper 180-foot aquifer subbasin, an increased risk of downward vertical migration of contaminant plumes at Fort Ord, and increased outflows from the Monterey Subbasin into the 180-foot aquifer subbasin, which will reduce the sustainable yield of the Monterey Subbasin, which is overdrafted. Next slide. This is a figure that shows the groundwater gradients in the dune sand aquifer. You've heard a lot about the dune sand aquifer. One of the reasons is it's a really critical part of this proceeding. And I guess I want to just try and make sure everyone understands what this thing is. It's basically a 100-foot high pile of sand. okay? At its peak, it is over 100 to 120 feet thick. Naturally, rainfall falls on top of this huge pile of sand and infiltrates. And so a lot of these discussions are about how much infiltrates. And this is data which shows the basically the direction of groundwater flow. So after it infiltrates from rainfall, you get flow on one side of what's called a groundwater divide towards the ocean, and the other towards the Salinas River. All of those little dots there that you see with the numbers, those are water level measurements that have been collected by Fort Ord in this aquifer. It has been the focus of studies at Fort Ord for over 20 to 30 years, when contamination was first discovered as a result of basically Fort Ord's legacy operations at the facility. And so there have been hundreds of wells put into this aquifer, from which we have both water level data and water quality data. And what the information from those wells shows is that groundwater from the dune sand aquifer flows towards what is known as the Fort Ord Salinas Valley Aquitard. So this is an aquitard that underlies this, this mound of sand. And so after the water infiltrates into this sand, it flows, what is west of that groundwater divide flows towards the beach, and then it hits the FOSVA and drops down into the upper 180. Now, I've also included on this figure data that we've collected, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, with regard to water quality. This is reflective that the bright blue color is an area where there's actual TDS data that's been collected from wells at Fort Ord. And then the area which is in darker color, that's AEM data. So that's not as precise. You know, what we know is that basically that generally indicates areas where concentrations are less than 3,000. It doesn't have the same resolution as well data, where I know that the water level, where the TDS concentrations are less than 1,000. But the data basically in the Fort Ord area are very consistent. So that's the way that I wanted to. The other thing I guess I wanted to explain is that, you know, Fort Ord, the reason that all of the money and time has been spent to basically remediate contamination that has occurred, and there's been a lot of work done. There's been over $300 million spent in remediating groundwater at Fort Ord. And this is all within the dune sand aquifer and the upper 180-foot aquifer. And so the reason this has been done is because these are considered critical aquifers associated with recharge to the subbasin. The idea that these do not matter is a total fallacy. And I can tell you that it's the regional board that has driven much of the work at Fort Ord and driven remediation to MCLs, because these are important aquifers. Next slide. So this is the conceptual site model. This is directly from Fort Ord's website. And it is consistent with MCWD's conceptual model. So what we have is a concept where you have this huge pile of sand, right? And you get all of this rain, you get rainfall, about 15 inches a year, give or take. And that basically infiltrates into the dune sand aquifer. Some portion of it, of course, gets evapotranspirated. But a significant portion of it actually infiltrates into the dune sand. Then it flows towards the beach and back in underneath and recharges that upper 180-foot aquifer. And how we know this is because water level data and TDS data show us that that aquifer is fresh, even though the water is moving inland. Next slide. So this is data from the The upper 180-foot aquifer from the spring of 2021, it looks very similar to other periods. And what we see is that groundwater, so these are groundwater levels now in the upper 180-foot aquifer, where you see the flow is inland. I've also included here, again, the bright blue on the bottom where all of those wells are located. That's an area where we have water quality data from wells, and that is fresh. The area which is in darker blue, that's where we have AEM data. Again, not quite as reliable, but very consistent with what we're seeing in the well data. And the areas which you see hatched, that's where we don't have any data. Basically, those are areas where there hasn't been anything collected, and the AEM data is not available because they could not fly over the city of Marina, and there's a lot of interference when there's streets and electrical and other things which make it really hard for the AEM data. You can't collect it. But we have assumed that that area is fresh. And this is why it relates to our conceptual model, which is that groundwater flows from the dune sand, this huge pile of sand, down towards the FOSVA, and then comes back into the 180. And because we see with all of our well data that it's fresh inland of those areas that we have hatched, it tells us that they also have to be fresh because there's no other way for the water in the upper dune sand to be fresh inland of those areas. So that's the basis for our contours, and where we don't have actual data, this is the type of conceptual understanding that we have utilized in developing our work. Next slide. These are a couple of the plumes that historically existed at Fort Ord. There's been a lot of work done to remediate these. But they are some of the basis upon which the conceptual model that was developed by Fort Ord was created, because they saw not only groundwater level data, but contaminant plumes, which actually are essentially a tracer. And what you see is that they migrate down towards the beach. And then there's a couple areas where we've actually seen there have been wells that permeated through the FOSVA, and they dropped down in some cases through them and through that aquitard, and then started migrating in the other direction. Next slide. So these are groundwater elevations that, again, these are from the spring of 2022. And my point here is that groundwater elevations in both the dune sand and the upper 180-foot aquifer, where we have data, show that water levels in those areas are above mean sea level. So mean sea level, I know you would all think it was 0, but it's not, because we're in NAVD 88. So it turns out in the area of Monterey, mean sea level is basically 3 feet. If you're in NAVD 88, which is what all of this data is presented in. So if you look at those numbers, those are actually groundwater elevations. The word I have circled, those are groundwater elevations that show that basically the water levels in both the dune sand and the upper 180 are greater than sea level near the beach. And this is because of all of that recharge that you get off that dune sand that comes in, hits the beach, basically close to the beach, and then creates a mound and turns around. Next slide. Same thing here. This is from August of 2022. So in some cases here, the water levels have dropped, but they're still consistently above mean sea level in the Monterey subbasin. Next slide. So this is that figure that Mr. Trudell, Dr. Trudell showed. And I've included for you something that I thought was really helpful in visualizing what's going on. And this was created with the AEM data. So on the left, what you can see is you have the dune sand aquifer, which receives all of this recharge. And then basically west of the divide, the groundwater flows towards the beach. And then you can see that blue area. So this has, again, been developed with AEM, where that upper 180-foot aquifer, it's fresh. And it goes on to recharge the rest of the Monterey subbasin and many portions of the 180, 400-foot aquifer subbasin. Underneath it, we do have seawater intrusion. So the lower 180-foot aquifer and 400-foot aquifers are seawater intruded in the northern portion of the Monterey subbasin. As you move south, they also freshen up. Next slide. So what happens is if you lose that protective head, that mound near the beach, what's going to happen is the seawater will readily flow into the upper 180-foot aquifer, because as I indicated, water levels in that aquifer, once you get beyond the beach, they're below sea level. So if you lose the mound at the beach, there will be nothing to stop basically the water from the submarine portions of the aquifer, which are saline, to move into the upper 180-foot aquifer, and we will lose the recharge from the dune sand aquifer into the subbasin. Next slide. These are maps from the Monterey Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Plan. They include data only collected since 2018. So I would like you to focus on the data in the dune sand aquifer and the upper 180-foot aquifer. They show that all of the concentrations in these aquifers are essentially fresh. Now, as I think Mr. Leffler indicated, there are a couple hits of high concentrations right there in the center of Fort Ord in the upper 180-foot aquifer. Well, if you look, it turns out that that location is underneath a landfill. It is contaminated by Fort Ord, and that is the source. It is not seawater intrusion at that location. It is a result of contamination that occurred at Fort Ord. Now, as you get very close to the beach, there is a well that's right there by the beach, and yes, it's seawater intruded. So we basically have seawater intrusion right there waiting to come in. In the lower 180, 400-foot aquifer, it is seawater intruded in the northern portion of the basin, and you can see the data points that we have. These have been collected since 2018, and you can see that the southern portion of the Monterey subbasin is fresh, but that northern portion where you have all of those red dots, that is seawater intruded. On the bottom right, you have the deep aquifer, and there's not very many wells. However, they are still fresh. And as I said, there's been a lot of work. This is all within the Monterey Subbasin GSP. The Monterey Subbasin GSP was submitted to DWR. It has been approved by DWR. It has been reviewed by multiple agencies and agreed upon by not only MCWD, but the Salinas Valley Basin GSA. The dune sand aquifer and the 180-foot aquifer are considered principal aquifers in the Monterey subbasin. Next slide. Now, what I've done for you here is presented the data in the same data essentially within the model domain. So that square gives you the model domain, that was used by both MCWD and CalAm. And so what I've shown here is the data that we have in that dune sand aquifer. This is all well data that's been collected. And you can see that in the dune sand aquifer. And then you have the upper 180-foot aquifer. So these are concentrations which are less than 800 milligrams per liter. On the right there, you can see that the blue, and then anything that's green is between 800 and 1,000. And these represent actual well data. And we have provided all of this data, and we provided it to CalAm over a year ago. I mean, this is data for Fort Ord that was in MCWD 11. And we have been talking about this for the last year about how the data shows that the aquifer is fresh in the upper 180. Next slide. And I'd like to show you what CalAm has included in its model. Now, on the left, you have the data as we know it, and then we have what CalAm actually included in its model for the contours. And you can see, so I've got the 1500 milligram per liter contour that's shown. That's CalAm's. These are all CalAm's. These are directly removed from the model. We basically pulled them out of the model. And one thing we noticed is these don't actually match the figures that are in CalAm's report. In either case, they're still wrong. What we have is, you can see that 1000 milligram per liter contour and the 1500 is going right through areas we know are less than 800 milligrams per liter. And next slide. I've blown it up for you here. And these are, again, directly removed from CalAm's solute transport model. The area that's in bright green, that's an area that CalAm assigned a TDS concentration of 1000 to 1500 milligrams per liter. These are data collected in the water year 2019, which is the start of the calibration period for the model. Some of these data are specific conductance data, which has been translated to TDS. If you do a translation, you might get, 50 to 100% higher, depending on how you decide to convert. But you can see that none of them are close to between 1000 and 1500 milligrams per liter, with the exception of, you see that nice data point there, that 2741, that green, that yellow data point. Well, if you take a look, like I said, that's right underneath a landfill at Fort Ord. Look at the beach. Again, we have a lot of data points which show those are all blue. They're less than 800. And this is representative of all of that water flowing off the dune sand coming into the upper 180-foot aquifer. Next slide. Now, I just want to help you understand this. So this is the area that's identified in red is the area of the upper dune sand complex. So this is that 100-foot pile of sand, okay? Do you notice there's no rivers in that area? And that's because there's no runoff. So the areas that are north, you see all of those rivers, that's a result of the fact that water, when it rains, can't infiltrate fast enough. And it ends up running off and ending up in a river. But that's not true in the dune sand aquifer, because here you have a huge pile of sand. And so that's why you get all of this recharge in this area. Next slide. So we spent a lot of time, EKI did, back when we first started this process, and we started talking to CalAm about, when we started to coordinate our efforts, and we did a soil moisture balance model that tried to really quantify what is the recharge in this dune sand aquifer. And we provided a recharge memo, which was given to CalAm's experts and is included in my testimony. And one of the things, not only do you have this area of dune sand, but as CalAm talked about, when you have an urban area, there is actually less recharge normally because you have a lot of impervious surfaces. But in all of the areas where there are urban areas, MCWD has invested millions of dollars to capture and recharge all of that water. And why do you think that is? Because it's precious. I mean, the whole idea is that you have all of this water coming in. They are taking it and re-infiltrating it. As far as we can tell, that was something that CalAm did not incorporate into its model. Although we provided that information over a year ago. Next slide. So, there's been discussions about, what's a normal amount of recharge. And you can go through models and talk about which data set was used. But in our model, we estimated about 6 inches per year, 6.14 inches per year in that dune sand complex. So it rains about 15 inches per year. So this is a little less than half, right? This is in this sand where you basically get all of this water that drops onto the dune sand and then infiltrates. Cal-Am, actually during its calibration period, which it assumed a higher rainfall period, it estimated 6.63 inches per year. But during its long-term period, it estimated 5.62 inches per year, which was slightly less than what we estimated. But we're like, hey, that's about the same number, sounds good. And now in this most recent, I think there's been a lot of talk about it, but basically they created a reduced recharge sensitivity model where they've dropped the recharge by 64%. It ends up being 1.98 inches per year. It's basically about 15% of rainfall. I'm sorry, but you can think about a pile of sand and the idea that you would have only 1.98 inches per year of recharge, which is pretty consistent with what you see in all those other areas where there's all of those, rivers, doesn't make sense. And we strongly disagree with it. Next slide. And I think people have talked about this, but basically the mean residual that ends up occurring when you apply that low rate of recharge on there, you have the calibrated model results from by Cal-Am. They were pretty close. They were low by 1.2 feet in their prior model. And with the reduced recharge, they end up being about 8 feet too low. And this is really critical in the area that is west of the FOSVA because we already are too low. And we know that that's a critical area for evaluating impacts. Next slide. So I've spent some time actually putting together real data relative to model data. And Cal-Am and MCWD's models are consistently underestimate groundwater elevations of the dune sand and upper 180-foot aquifer west of the FOSVA. Now, why Cal-Am felt, given that they were underestimating the water levels, that they should reduce recharge is sort of beyond me, unless there was another ulterior motive. But I can tell you that we underestimated, that we saw we were underestimating. We would have loved to have spent time trying to fix this. We did not have the time. This is a graph from my report, my testimony, and I'm going to blow up these slides because I think they're very hard to see, but you can see where these are wells. This is data from wells along the beach there. So those red dots that you can see, these are hydrographs from those red dots. And next slide. So this is water level information. That's actual water level information from these wells. This is MW0210-180. That's, it's a 180-foot aquifer well that's been monitored by Fort Ord since the 1990s. And what we can see is that water levels, those are all the dots, these are actual water level measurements, are above mean sea level. Now, those lines that you see there, you can see mean sea level. That's also a dashed blue line there. So anything that's in light blue there is above mean sea level, and anything that's in pink is below mean sea level. And you can see the model estimated results. Both Cal-Am's flow model and MCWD's model, which is in orange. So we've got dark green and orange are below, basically mean sea level. So we are both underestimating recharge. Cal-Am's reduced recharge sensitivity model, further, basically that's in light green, ends up being even lower. Next slide. Did it switch? Yeah, thank you. Sorry. So this is yet another well, same thing, where you're basically well above sea level. Now, one thing I'd like to talk about here is, if you look at this, you might say, okay, well, look, there's plenty of room for water levels to drop by half a foot or a foot. Maybe we're 5 feet above mean sea level. But this is where the issue of variable density comes in. And I think Mr. Leffler actually talked about this, that when you're right next to the ocean, it does potentially matter that the ocean has higher salinity than this fresh water. So in fact, the seawater that's pushing against this mound is not, if you looked at it as a freshwater head, the way you could think about it is it's denser, so it can push harder. And if you have a water column that's 100 feet thick, if it's fresh, if it's saline water, what you want to do is, because of the density, raise the value by about 2.5 feet. So if the bottom of the 180-foot aquifer is about 100 feet, which, in this area, it's a little less, but just for, to help you understand. So if that were seawater that was pushing against it, it wouldn't be at 3 feet. It would be at 5 feet or 5.5 feet. So now you can see that what the amount of room that we have is so small, and that any reduction becomes a really big deal. So if you get drawdown in this area as a result of the project, all of a sudden it allows the seawater to flow in. Next slide. This is yet another well, same thing. You can see, again, we're underestimating relative to the actual water level measurements. Next slide. So this is MW1S. This is near the project. This is one of CalAM's wells, right next to the slant well. And you can see during the pilot test period how the water levels dropped well below sea level. So historically, water levels in this area are quite a bit above sea level. Now, they're probably influenced by a lot of the ponds that exist that you've heard a lot about, either the dredge pond, the percolation pond, where there's likely been discharges. And those discharges at the CMEX site, we can debate whether they're 35,000 milligrams per liter or 29,000 milligrams per liter. But if you discharge any water that is that saline into this aquifer, you're going to make a mound of saline water, which is going to contaminate the dune sand aquifer in the vicinity of CMEX. And that's exactly what we see. So even though water levels in this area are well above sea level, it's highly contaminated. And that's because CMEX has been doing this since 1906. And what you can see is that when you drop the water levels in this area in the during the pilot test period, now all of a sudden your water levels are below sea level, and that's what's going to allow basically the seawater to flow in. Now, as you move further away, of course, they're not going to drop this much, but they're going to drop. Next slide. So this is a prediction of how much they're going to drop. These are the drops in the dune sand aquifer. These are the drawdowns estimated by the models. You have the CalAM model on the bottom, MCWD's model. So these are drawdown estimates projected by these models. And you can see there's significant drawdown along the coast in both models in the subbasin, which is going to reduce the protective heads, which are stopping seawater intrusion from migrating inland in the upper 180-foot aquifer. Next slide. You'll also end up losing storage, which we've talked about, somewhere in the range. MCWD's model estimates, between 1,500 and 2,000 acre feet. It's not acre feet per year, that's a total acre feet. and a estimated storage loss in the dune by CalAM's model, it's as much as 6,000 acre feet if you include all of the basically the 180, 400-foot aquifer subbasin. And we found that the drawdown loss and groundwater storage was pretty similar under all the scenarios. So we didn't recalculate this for all the different scenarios. Next slide. The other thing that we've been talking about here is the inflows from the ocean. So this, one of the things that we did as part of the phase 2 work, and this was something that the AHO had asked for, was for both models to estimate the increase in ocean flux that results that the models predict will result from the project. So the models basically were queried to figure out how much additional inflow occurs along the different reaches, so inside and outside of the capture zone. So you can see that capture zone reach, we have that, and then we have reach 2, which is in the Monterey subbasin, and reach 3, which is in the 180, 400-foot aquifer. Reach 1 is the seaside basin. Next slide. And what the models basically predict, this is MCWD's model. Under all the different scenarios, we found on average that this is for pumping option 3, so that's the 15.5 MGD, that the average increase in seawater inflows is about 950 acre feet. That's in the Monterey subbasin. That's not an insignificant number. Estimated recharge in the Monterey subbasin overall is about 10,000 acre feet per year. This is 949,000 acre feet every year of additional seawater inflows that the model predicts. That is every year. You have the other thing that I would have you take a look at is how much water is flowing into the capture zone reach. Now, again, this is being captured by the slant well. But if there's basically 14,000 acre feet per year that's coming into that slant well, it's not going to take long for that slant well capture zone to become fully inundated, even the inland piece. So one of the things that was asked of us to do was to evaluate what will happen if the project actually stops. In other words, it goes for 25 years and then something happens, or they lose their permit. What will happen to all of that seawater that has entered that capture zone? And Dr. Kincaid has some simulations of what happens to all of that mass that sits within that capture zone. Next slide. This is CalAM's estimate. So in the Monterey subbasin, that's reach 2. They estimate that an additional 666 acre feet per year will enter the subbasin. Next slide. So what happens as a result of these additional inflows? And Mr. Trudell showed some of those slides, but basically what it means is that concentrations of TDS increase in the Monterey subbasin, as well as in the northern portions of the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. Now, one of the things that we know is that there is no seawater intrusion within the upper 180-foot aquifer in the Monterey subbasin. And because both of the models underestimate heads, what we see with the transport models is that even under the non-pumping scenario, we get a lot of seawater intrusion, which we don't actually believe to be real. Next slide. So this is the dune sand aquifer. So in this area, again, we're also under predicting heads. But the issue is not as bad because basically it's a huge amount of sand and water, flow is generally towards the ocean. And so although we're under predicting heads, the water definitely does come around and go into the upper 180-foot aquifer, but we would actually see that area as being probably less saline than what the model predicts. But you can see the initial concentrations that are identified here with the, that's the dotted line. That's the 1500 milligram per liter contour. That's the initial concentration that's shown there. And you can see that it's slightly less than what the predicted migration of the seawater intrusion front will be after 25 years. So scenario 1B on the very left is the no project scenario. Scenario 3B is the with project scenario. And 3B minus 1B is the difference. So this provides an estimate of what the estimated increase in concentrations will be as a result of the project. And you can see that in the areas which are red and yellow and orange, they represent an increase. And then you have the areas in green, which represent a decrease. So just as I think Mr. Durbin talked about, immediately downgrading of the project, you have a reduction in gradients. And so what ends up happening is you end up basically getting an area which is less seawater intruded. However, that comes at the expense of the areas that are not down gradient of the capture zone, like the Monterey Subbasin, where the concentrations of TDS significantly increase. Next slide. So this is the upper 180-foot aquifer. So again, in scenario 1B there on the left, we are probably over predicting what is going to happen because this is current conditions and we don't see migration of the seawater intrusion front. Scenario 3B is with the project. So this would be the result. This shows what the concentrations would be with the project. And scenario 3B minus 1B, again on the right, that is the difference. And in my opinion, the difference between the seawater intrusion front with and without the project would be much more significant if we could get the water levels right at the beach. Because what would happen is you would see that under the no project scenario, you wouldn't have any significant seawater intrusion. But by dropping the heads, that would allow that the project will cause, it will either we won't have as much of a protective head, or it will allow that seawater intrusion to come in. Next slide. I'm going to skip through this slide. Next slide. So this is Cal-Am's model. And this actually is their estimate of what the seawater intrusion, this is the same 3B minus 1B after 25 years. You can see that the results are actually quite similar, where the difference in concentrations are significant in the Monterey Subbasin if you look at 3B minus 1B. So you get a significant, or what I would say is a high increase in concentrations behind the seawater, basically in that Monterey Subbasin. And you can even see in this scenario that there is a predicted difference in the seawater intrusion front as well. But I think you have to be really careful when you look at that line. I think really the best we can do with these estimates with these model predictions is to get a sense of what's going to happen, because there's a huge amount of uncertainty associated with these transport models. Next slide. This is an estimate of increased downward gradients that MCWD's model estimates. And this is of particular concern in the area of Fort Ord, where there is still residual contamination. This is the A aquifer, and what we see is that there'll be an additional downward gradient of about half a foot to a foot where some of these contaminants still remain. It doesn't result in a huge amount of groundwater, additional groundwater migration from the dune sand into the upper 180. But the concern is that, the MCL for many of these compounds is, 5 micrograms per liter. So any migration is potentially problematic. Next slide. So we've talked a lot about the calibration of the transport model. And I guess what I'd like to say is that, in my opinion, there was not enough information collected during the CMEX, basically of the CMEX operations, in order to be able to estimate what happened during the slant well pilot test. We did our best. We looked at the water levels from the dredge pond and allowed that to infiltrate. We looked at the specific conductivity measurements from the dredge pond, which are very close to seawater, which is what you would expect, basically, because it's ocean water that fills that dredge pond. And we looked at what the actual concentrations in dune sand aquifer wells are. There's no information, of course, about what the concentrations are in the submarine portions of the aquifer, but we did our best at trying to estimate what was potentially going on. Next slide. Callium doesn't really provide any calibration of its 2023 of its transport model, and relies on what it did back in 2022. And I mean, I'll be honest, they give us a lot of heartache for not having included information for the CMEX ponds, but there's a good reason we didn't include it. And that's because there's not enough data, in our opinion. We haven't seen the data that would allow you to estimate how much was discharged and what the concentrations were. Callium never included the CMEX percolation ponds in any of their prior work, including their CMEX model. So not only is there TDS being TDS impacts, but there's drawdown impacts too, in the sense that if the CMEX ponds actually did discharge 985 acre feet per year, that's about a third of what the slant well was pumping. So this gives us a lot of pause as to the validity of any OWP estimates with regard to, based on the fact that we don't believe you can actually calibrate the model during the test slant well. Next slide. So this is basically the same slide, what I've just said. Next slide. I'd like to talk, and I think Dr. Kincaid will talk a lot about this, but there are a huge amount of uncertainty associated in these models. You have to understand that the TDS concentrations that are inputted into these models are, what have been measured, and that there's no real matching of historical seawater intrusion. So you really can't calibrate the model to historical migration. So I really disagree with Mr. Durbin. I do not think that these models can predict that when you see that the seawater intrusion line has moved backward, in these simulations, I do not believe that. There is no information that would suggest that the seawater intrusion front is not either stable or moving forward based on the data that I have seen for the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. So I think that is a problem with the transport model. There's very big problems with parameterization. They are uncertain. We don't know what the longitudinal transverse dispersivity, the effective porosity. Effective porosity is what really makes a difference in how fast things are going. I don't think we have a good handle on that. Also, we don't know what the TDS concentrations are in the subterranean portions of the aquifer, which they're totally unknown. And then, as we've talked about, the models presume that pumping continues into seawater and treated wells. Therefore, I think you have to take all of the data from the transport models. You really have to look at it as just something that provides information about the processes that are occurring. If you have more seawater intrusion in a certain, basically more ocean water flowing into the aquifer, yes, the concentrations of TDS increase. Do I feel comfortable telling you that they're going to increase by 350, milligrams per liter or what they're going to do at MCWD's wells, I do not think that these models can predict that. Next slide. There's been work associated. Mr. Leffler actually has done some work and submitted the Monterey Associates variable density model, which he updated. I'm just going to, I know there's additional testimony regarding this, but what I wanted everybody to know is that this model has been withdrawn and is being recalibrated by Montgomery because basically based on comments by the GTAC, it was determined that it was not, it really was unsuitable to assess potential project impacts by Sigma. And that's because the water levels and seawater intrusion are incredibly poorly calibrated in the Monterey subbasin. So we do not feel is used for assessing CalAm project impacts. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. This is my last topic, and this is related to cross-boundary flows. One of the things that we have done, and the AHO asked both parties to do, was to assess basically what project impacts will have on cross-boundary flows. These are outflows from the Monterey subbasin. And this is really important because the Monterey subbasin is in overdraft. You know, there's about, as I said, about 10,000 acre feet per year of recharge to the Monterey subbasin. The Monterey subbasin is basically losing storage of about 4,000 acre feet. So maybe what I can do is sort of walk you through this. The natural recharge in the Monterey subbasin is basically about 10,000 acre feet per year. There's about 5,000 acre feet per year, which is extracted, you know, by MCWD and other users. And so if the basin didn't have excessive cross-boundary flows, we would be sustainable. 10,000 acre feet per year of recharge, 5,000 acre feet per year of, you know, extraction. But due to the amount of pumping, and as you've seen, all of those agricultural wells that exist in the 180-foot aquifer subbasin, you get massive outflows from the Monterey subbasin inland. This is not a natural condition. So what ends up happening is the net cross-boundary flows from the Monterey subbasin into the 108, basically net cross-boundary flows. So in versus out. There's about, the model basically says there's about 12,000 acre feet per year of outflows from the Monterey subbasin into the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. Now we get some inflows from the Seaside Basin and others. So the net ends up being basically about 9,000. So if you take, you have 10,000 acre feet per year that rains on the basin, we take out 5, and now we lose an additional 9,000. That makes you negative 4,000 acre feet. This is a massive problem for the Monterey subbasin. And this project will increase cross-boundary flows. The estimates, if you look at all of the aquifers, it's anywhere between 1,200 and 2,100 acre feet per year. Now, some of that will go into the capture zone. And some of that is actually seawater intruded. So if we look just at the dune sand and the upper 180-foot aquifer, those are fresh, as I've shown you, in the Monterey subbasin. They are the subject of all of the work that Fort Ord has been doing to clean them up. And that is because they are fresh. We get a loss of about 500 to, 1,100 acre feet per year of fresh groundwater leaving the basin as in addition in those cross-boundary flows as a result of the project. Next slide. This is basically a breakout under all the different scenarios. So in Reach A, which is basically outside of that capture zone, that mixing zone, as CalAm has called it, this is in the dune sand and upper 180-foot aquifer. So I'm not counting any of the stuff that's lower. So you have about, in that reach outside the capture zone, you get anywhere between 100 to 350 acre feet per year. But then you also have a certain percentage that goes into that mixing zone from the Monterey subbasin in these fresh aquifers. And that's in the range of about, 400 to 600 or so. Now, some of that water in the mixing zone that crosses, some of that is probably ocean water that the slant well has pulled in. So, my opinion is that for example, under scenario 3B minus 1B, that the increase in cross-boundary flows is somewhere between 228 to 666 acre feet per year based on MCWD's model. Next slide. This is CalAm's model. They actually estimate a higher loss in cross-boundary flows. So if you look at 3B minus 1B, it would be anywhere between 528 acre feet per year to as much as 1,100 acre feet per year. My bad. And this again is very significant for the Monterey subbasin. It is something that is documented in the Monterey GSP. It is well established in that document and of huge concern. Next slide. So in my opinion, CalAm's estimates underestimate the loss in sustainable yield due to the fact that they really don't acknowledge that the dune sand aquifer and the upper 180-foot aquifer is fresh. So when they sort of identify the area that is seawater intruded, they overestimate that area, as I think, I've proven with the available data that we have. But even so, the CalAm's experts estimate the loss in sustainable yield to be about 222 acre feet based on their own assessment of where the groundwater is fresh. Now they say, what's 222 acre feet per year? It's not significant. EKI recently did a water supply augmentation study in the Monterey subbasin for basically taking recycled water, advanced treated recycled water, and injecting it back into the Monterey subbasin. The estimated cost of that is $4,000 per acre foot. That shouldn't say acre feet per year. That should say per acre foot. So in order to, if you were going to replace that 222 acre feet per year, that would result in a cost of more than $880,000 per year to the Monterey, to MCWD. And if the amount is significantly more, that's an even bigger issue to MCWD. To the extent that the project increases outflows from the overdrafted adjudicated seaside basin, which I think has been some of the argument that it doesn't matter because we'll get some of this back from the seaside basin. That's not a benefit to Monterey subbasin. I mean, it's pretty clear that actions are going to have to be taken to address additional outflows from an adjudicated basin. Next slide. We've been talking about this for a lot, about the fact that the CalAm experts really argue that the project will only increase seawater intrusion that's already intruded. And they really focus on the line, which has been identified as the seawater intrusion front. But as Mr. Durbin has testified, there's actually quite a few production wells that exist in that area. And that's because there are areas of fresh water, just like there is in the upper 180-foot aquifer. That area is identified as fully seawater intruded by Monterey, basically Monterey County Water Resources Agency. Yet, as part of remediation efforts, there's over 1,000 acre feet per year being extracted from that area. And it has been for 20 years. There's a lot of areas where the area is not fully seawater intruded, and introducing a lot more seawater into those areas does constitute harm. Next slide. So in my opinion, the project will result in additional ocean inflows and widespread increases of TDS concentrations north and south of the project in the Monterey subbasin and 180 400-foot aquifer subbasin, including current freshwater areas of the subbasin under all the model scenarios. A loss in groundwater storage within the Monterey subbasin, resulting from project-induced drawdowns in groundwater elevations, a reduction in sustainable yield of the Monterey subbasin as a result of additional cross-boundary flows to the 180-foot aquifer subbasin induced by the project pumping, and an impaired ability for MCWD to meet its compliance with currently approved SGMA regulatory mandates, causing measurable harm to MCWD and the beneficial users of the groundwater within the Monterey subbasin. And that concludes my testimony.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. I have a couple of questions for you. I will articulate them to the best of my ability. First of all, you talked about this early in your presentation on the recharge issue. I just wanted to clarify, because I think if I understood, I want to compare this to what Dr. Trudell said, but if I understood you correctly, I think you said, and these are not your exact words, but you essentially said that you disagree with the recharge estimates by CalAm for the dune sand aquifer in its RS scenario as too low. Right, and we looked at some charts. Now there you are on my screen. Thank you. I'll stop there. Is that I understood you correctly on that point so far?
Yes, that's correct. And I think, I mean, I don't want to speak for Dr. Trudell, but I know that some of his criticisms in the past really related to the overall recharge within the model that CalAm had historically submitted, not specifically to the dune sand. I think the dune sand area, that Marina, as well as MCWD experts, believe that the recharge in that area is, what we've estimated in the model, which is about 6 inches per year, and what CalAm historically estimated of about 5 inches per year is a reasonable estimate of recharge, and that dropping it by 60% is not appropriate. But I'll let Mr. Trudell, I'll let Dr. Trudell speak for himself.
Speak to that, yes, please, yes. Dr. Trudell, if you wouldn't mind, just on this issue, just to make sure I understand, if you would address whether I understood you to say in response to my questions in your testimony and in response to my questions that you thought CalAm's estimate of recharge was too high, even in its original model. And maybe you can clarify here whether you were talking about the dune sand aquifer specifically or on an overall basis. What I'm trying to get at is whether you and Ms. Nelson have a disagreement here. I mean, to put it bluntly.
No, her explanation is correct. I was referring to the overall groundwater recharge in the whole model domain, the whole landward model domain. I was not isolating my critique of CalAm's recharge to just the dune sand aquifer. The numbers are not that different in the dune sand aquifer, but overall for the model domain, they're substantially different, about 35% different. Theirs was too high by 35%.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Trudell, that's helpful. And then Ms. Nelson, I think I just have one more question, which is that, well, no, more than one. Let me back up. I understood you to say that you thought both models under predicted the head near the groundwater head near the coast in specific areas. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, pretty much all along the coast, west of the FOSVA. So all of the wells that we have, that are calibration wells in that area are under predicted.
So as a result of that, is it your opinion that the MCWD model would then also underestimate impacts from the project, for example, comparing 3B and the 1B scenario?
Yes, because what ends up happening is that we believe that under current conditions, there is no seawater intrusion in the upper, this is particular to the upper 180-foot aquifer. So what we see is that we're underestimating heads. And so we have this mound. And so we think that under the no project condition, which is 1B, you shouldn't be seeing any seawater intrusion. And that the project will actually drop water levels along that coast, and that will create the seawater intrusion. So basically, there'll be a bigger difference between the area that will become seawater intruded with no project versus with the project.
Thank you. And so my follow-up is, it's general, so I'll leave it to you to fill this in, but what I essentially want to understand is, is it your opinion that the MCWD model is useful to assess impacts from the project, given it's, I understand you have criticism of CalAM's model, serious criticism of theirs as well, but do you find the MCWD model to be useful to assess impacts from the project?
I think you can gain an awful lot from it. Is it perfect? No. And these transport models, are they perfect? Absolutely not. But what they do show is they give you a general sense that if you drop the heads along the coast, you increase seawater intrusion. How much that will increase? Do I think that the exact concentration on any of those plots or the exact line is correct? No. But I think that what it shows you is exactly what we've been saying all along, which is when you drop the heads along the coast, you see induced seawater intrusion, which results in an increase in concentrations. In the upper 180, so in the, the lower 180-foot aquifer in the 400, it's probably, those increases probably are pretty consistent because we don't have this problem of the mound. In the upper 180-foot aquifer, I think the model is not adequately able to show the difference of the with project, without project. And I know that CalAM is really focused on, okay, well, with the project, I see this, and without and there's no difference. I would suggest there is a difference in the sense that the concentrations are significantly higher behind the 1500 line. I think what I'm saying is that the difference in where the seawater intrusion front with and without the project would be more significant if you were able to account for the heads. You wouldn't just see increases in concentration behind the 1500 line, but you would see a bigger difference between where those two lines are. Again, though, please take these transport models with, the grain of salt. I do not believe that there's going to be a reduction in seawater intrusion in the 180, 400-foot aquifer, unless there's a lot of work that's done by cutting back pumping in that aquifer. In that basin. I don't see it.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and I think that running into the grain of salt it's unavoidable in this proceeding. Okay. One last question, and it's not intended to be I just want to make sure I understand. I understand this is having to do with the last one of your last topics about net outflow from the Monterey subbasin. And I worked with Sigma quite a bit, so I understand Sigma and I understand at least the legal aspect of the drawing of the subbasins, and I understand legally why outflow in terms of the balance sheet for the basin could be a potentially a big problem for the basin. I think your words were big problem. I just wanted to make sure I'm not missing something physical, that outflow from the Monterey subbasin, if it's a big problem for the Monterey subbasin, it's potentially a big benefit for the 180-400 subbasin. You don't have to say yes to this, but you can characterize it in your own way. But that's what I'm getting at. It's a loss to the Monterey subbasin, but there would be a corresponding gain of groundwater to the 180-400 foot aquifer subbasin. Is that correct?
That is correct, but they've committed to raising water levels in that subbasin to, in their GSP, they've said that they will raise water levels back to 2015 levels in order to stop those, basically to limit some of those cross-boundary flows. Because I think, as you know, with Sigma, there is an intent so that one person's GSP can't stop another from attaining sustainability. And I think that people recognize that in the absence of raising water levels in the 180-400, the Monterey subbasin can't become sustainable. I think we could almost come to the point where we couldn't pump it all and we still wouldn't be sustainable. So that's, and there have been discussions about this internally. We worked extensively with the Salinas Valley Basin GSA, and what we agreed to do in the Monterey GSP was to take a look, and we said, okay, in the future, as long as the 180-400 GSP reaches its sustainable goals, which is to raise water levels to 2015 levels, they will stop the outflow. Basically, we can become sustainable. And that's really a lot of what, scenario D looks at. Will they achieve that? Okay, your guess is as good as mine, but if I can tell you that maybe if they don't achieve it through Sigma, the courts might come into that. But I can tell you that we can't achieve sustainability without the 180-foot aquifer subbasin raising water levels. And so those have been the discussions and the commitments, that have sort of been made between the different parties. How they will actually play out, I can't tell you, but this project will not help.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. I am going to look to my team. Do you, either Ms. Graziano or Mr. Wooldridge, do you have any questions for Ms. Nelson at this time?
I do not.
Thank you.
Hi, I have one.
Okay.
And unfortunately, when I took a screenshot, I did not get the page number, so I'm trying to figure out which one it is.
Tell me, I probably know.
It's the TDS measured at the Fort Ord wells, where you mentioned that there's a landfill
Oh, yeah.
measurement.
I can show you. I can show you from the GSP. It's the first, what you want to pull up is slide 12. So you can see this is from the GSP, and there's a blow up of this. So in the upper 180-foot aquifer, you can see that there's a orange dot in the middle of all of those blue and green dots, sort of in the middle of the subbasin.
Maybe can we zoom in, Ms. Mullen? We're looking at the upper 180-foot aquifer, correct?
Yeah.
Correct.
Upper right figure.
And I have the actual data from this, but I think this is helpful because it gives you a full shot of the basin. So you see where that sort of red dot and yellow dot are in the middle of all those green and blue dots?
The orange and the yellow, yes.
Yeah. So those are related to releases they were right underneath a landfill, a former landfill at Fort Ord.
Are they
They're
two
not
separate
related.
landfills?
Yeah, that whole area is basically, it's a contamination area where they had several landfills.
Okay. And what other factors do you consider that, this is a landfill and not just seawater?
Because I've got 20 other wells surrounding it that show that it's fresh. So I don't see how that could be seawater intrusion. I'm sure I have not gone and done an analysis to see what type. Sometimes you can actually look at what the concentrations are. And if it's chloride versus other TDS, my guess is if I looked, it would not be chloride, but I haven't bothered to do that analysis. I felt that there was more than enough data. I looked at where that data point is, and I said it's right below a landfill. I got 20 other wells that are fresh right around it. That's not seawater intrusion.
And do we have anything after 2015?
Yeah, this actually, scroll down. So all of these data actually, this is post
This is post, I'm
2015,
sorry.
but it's actually, this data actually was all collected and is included in MCWD 11. And if you go to the next, I'll tell you which slide. So the data that's shown on slide number 15. So here you can see those two data points. This is actually the data that was collected from, in water year 20. It's basically in December of 2018. It's water year 2019. And this was the data that was provided to CalAm over a year ago.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ms. Graziano. Did you have any other questions?
I may later. I was
That's fine.
typing so fast, so.
That's fair. You reserve your right to ask questions later.
Yeah.
I think at this point,
Ms. Kunzik, I don't have a cross-examination question, but on the very first slide that had shades of blue, one of them was bright and the other one was darker. And I don't know if it's my eyes, but if she could just tell me which ones were which.
Sure.
This is slide 1.
I think it was
Yeah,
slide.
actually, you can go. It might
Slide
be
4.
easier. Yeah, actually, it might be easier to go. All right, yeah, slide 4, sure.
Yeah, just there's two shades of blue, but none of them look bright or dark to me. I just didn't want to misunderstand her and waste time.
So
with it.
maybe the way to look at it is, do you see where all of the dots are?
Yeah,
Okay, so that's well data. That what you see there.
and I just need the color. Is that the bright blue?
That's the bright blue.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
And I apologize. I just thought that would.
No,
And
that's
just for Mr. Asias, it over on the right-hand side, I think it's got, in my picture, it looks kind of, I'll call it sky blue. And then it's just a little,
Yeah, I saw the legend and I couldn't tell. That's why I asked the question.
okay, very good.
Yeah, I assume it's duplicating the colors. I just must have dim color receptors. So, but now I know the area because I can see the difference. I appreciate that.
or it's the
Yeah.
screen. I am also having sometimes what is described as brown looks to black to me. So maybe either way, our eyes have the same problem or our screens have the same problem. So
Yeah.
I think we're through with this, Ms. Mullen. We can take that down. Thank you. So I think what I'd like to do is take a very short break. I am hoping we can get through one more witness today. That's not all 4 as we had hoped, but that's 3 out of 4. So my plan is to just to take 5 minutes and then turn to Mr. Titsa. It looks like that in my list of the next witness. Are there any concerns or objections to that approach? 5-minute break and then turning to Mr. Titsa. All right, let's go ahead and do that. We will return at 3:48. All right, it is just turned to 3:49, and I think we are turning next to Mr. Titsa, and I'm not sure which attorney will be. Maybe Mr. Spalding, you came off mute by chance. Mr. Spalding, are you presenting Mr.
Good
Titsa?
afternoon. Yes, I'll be working with Mr. Titsa.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, Mr. Titsa. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
If you would please raise your right hand and I will administer the oath. Mr. Titsa, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. I turn to you, Mr. Spalding.
Thank you. Mr. Titsa, I believe that you have prepared 4 documents that have been marked as exhibits. And let me go over them quickly. We have Marina exhibit number 62, which is your phase 3 rebuttal testimony. We have exhibit 63, which is your statement of qualifications. We have exhibit 64, which are your rebuttal figures. And then finally, we have your summary slides, which are exhibit 68. Can you confirm that these 4 exhibits are true and correct copies of documents that you prepared?
Yes, I can confirm that.
All right, we would request, Ms. Mullen, that you display Marina exhibit 68.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. So this is my phase 3 rebuttal testimony. Can you go to the next slide, please? So starting off just briefly with professional qualifications, my CV is in evidence, so that I'll just point out a couple of high points that are important to this testimony. And that is that in 2019, I was retained by the city of Marina and the Marina GSA to prepare a groundwater sustainability plan for their jurisdictional area. And as part of that work, I studied and became very familiar with the local setting, hydrogeologic and water quality data, hydrostratigraphic data, the AEM data developed by Rosemary Knight and her team from Stanford. And I compiled and evaluated that information for the purpose of putting together sustainable management criteria, defining management actions, defining implementation support activities, and monitoring networks, focused largely on seawater intrusion as the primary sustainability criterion that was at risk in the area. Since that time, I was retained by the city to serve as their representative on the Seawater Intrusion Technical Advisory Committee and the Groundwater Technical Advisory Committee after that was disbanded within the Salinas Valley Groundwater Basin GSA. I would point out that during part of that time, I appointed Steve Carlton as the primary contact, but he remained, we were working together and he was working under my direction. And so I was very closely aware of everything that was going on, but he attended a couple of meetings by himself. And then as part of that, I reviewed and commented on development and calibration of the Montgomery and Associates seawater intrusion model, which we'll refer to hereafter as the SWIM. Next slide, please. So the scope of this review and my opinions is to respond to testimony by Mr. Peter Leffler that he set forth in CalAm Exhibits 175 and 178. And specifically reviewing and commenting on his design, construction, and use of a variable density groundwater model that's based on the SWIM. And the key point being that the Leffler model retains the basic because the Leffler model retains the basic model architecture of the SWIM with a few modifications, I reviewed, and my testimony will touch on both models. And specifically focusing on the ability of the SWIM and the Leffler model to function as variable density flow models. So just a brief word about variable density flow models. Groundwater flow and solute transport models are based on the basic understanding that groundwater flows from high heads to low heads in accordance with the gradients and the permeability and properties of the medium that they're flowing through. Variable density models add the additional understanding that water will flow from high density, high unit weight per unit volume to low unit weight per unit volume. And that's important in the nearshore environment where you can get juxtaposition of high salinity contrasts, meaning also you get juxtaposition of high density contrasts. Next slide, please. So just a brief summary of the SWIM. As I mentioned, the Loeffler model is an adaptation of the SWIM that retains its basic architecture and hydrogeologic conceptual model. So that's a term I'm going to be talking about quite a bit. It's essentially the bones that the model are built on, the basic concept structure of the model. And the SWIM was developed for a very specific purpose, and that's to assess the effectiveness of projects and management actions under the Salinas Valley Basin GSA's groundwater sustainability plan to prevent advance of the inland seawater intrusion front. And that was defined by the 500 milligram per liter chloride contour, and it's up to 7 miles inland. And that's specifically the definition that defines the management criteria by which sustainable management is defined in the GSP for seawater intrusion. It's that 500 milligram per liter contour by which success or failure or sustainability or unsustainability of the plan is defined. And so that's what it was focused on being able to evaluate. And in its review of the SWIM, initially, most of the GTAC members generally agreed that the model could be useful for evaluating regional project alternatives, but that there were some issues around the model being able to evaluate local impacts, and that would require a more refined tool. Now, I heard just recently in Ms. Nelson's testimony that Montgomery and Associates has pulled the model back for more work, but this is what was discussed during the GTAC meeting. The next slide, please. So just a brief overview of the SWIM calibration performance. The graph in the middle shows on the vertical axis simulated heads, and on the horizontal axis observed heads. The 45-degree line going up, the dashed line going up the middle, it would be a 1-to-1 correlation or a perfect calibration, which of course you never get. The different colors of the dots are different aquifer areas or depths. And so what you can see is, ideally what you'd like to see is an elongate cloud of dots that are kind of situated along that line, but you definitely see here that there's a prevalence of dots below the line that indicate a bias in the underlying model. So that the bias is that the model tends to simulate heads that are lower than the observed heads. And in some cases by 50 feet or more, up to even a couple of 100 feet. The two tiles on the left show a plan view or aerial view of the same thing, with the upper left being the 180-foot aquifer, the lower left being the 400-foot aquifer, and the size of the circles is the amount of over-prediction or under-prediction of observed heads. And green means the model predicts lower heads than are observed, and red means they predict higher heads than observed. So what you see in the upper left-hand tile is that you have larger dots in kind of the central inland area. And what that creates is inland gradients or landward gradients that would accelerate flow from near the seashore or at the seashore into the basin. And then in the 400-foot tile down in the lower left-hand corner, you see that the largest circles are near the northern and southern edges of the basin. There's also a kind of a concentration near the seashore, but again, mostly in green dots that show that there's a bias to under-predicting heads. So that's just a general bias of that model. Next slide, please. The limitations of the SWIM are important to understand because the Loeffler model basically, and I'm going to refer to Mr. Loeffler's model as the Loeffler model. So he basically adopts it. And so there's a generally poor model calibration and bias, which underpredicts heads and overpredicts inland gradients. So if that bias is okay for a particular application, that doesn't make a difference, but that bias needs to be understood and accounted for in terms of using the model. And it was, it's my opinion, and it was the opinion of others on the GTAC, that that's probably largely due to a focus of calibrating the model to the 500 milligram per liter chloride contour and using that as a primary criterion and focusing less on calibration to groundwater heads. And that resulted in some sacrifice to the hydraulic integrity of the model. So the model incorrectly predicts seawater intrusion also into the Monterey and the seaside subbasins. And in the Monterey subbasin, it's incorrect. In the seaside subbasin, it shouldn't be predicting it at all. And that was an issue of contention during the GTAC meetings. I'll explain that in a moment. The model also incorrectly included a low permeability barrier near the southern basin boundary that was determined not to exist based on the most recent data. And the model extends the Salinas Valley and 1,400-foot aquatards all the way to the coast, limiting the ability to simulate vertical flow in areas where it doesn't exist or may not exist. So that's an important theme that I'll be touching on. And rather than refine the model at that time, Montgomery and Associates and SVB-GSA pointed out that they preferred to move forward with the model. They felt that it was good enough for their purposes, but to offer caveats regarding the areas where the model was not deemed to be accurate or was predicting or simulating seawater intrusion that did not actually exist. So since that time, I understand Vera Nelson indicated that it's actually been pulled back. Next slide, please. So the scope of Mr. Loeffler's model updates were using a sensitivity run modification approach to hydraulic conductivity, specific storage, and effective porosity. And in effect, taking the model and adjusting those parameters iteratively until a sufficiently improved match was achieved. So it's important to understand that while that's something that's commonly done, it's different from recalibrating a model or adjusting or refining or updating the hydrogeologic conceptual model or the model parameter attribution to better match the real world. It's just a systematic scaling up and down until you get a better match. It's not a very rigorous approach. There wasn't a recalibration or verification of updated calibration statistics that was reported. Just a recheck of performance from certain key wells. And the check at the selected wells did show an improved history match, but it showed a continued bias to underprediction of heads and overprediction of inland gradients. And as I'll share a little bit later, I believe that it's that retention of the extension of the aquatards all the way to the sea that creates that bias and affects the usability of the model and its ability to actually be useful for predicting or making conclusions about variable density flow. Next slide. So just a couple of words about the importance of a correct hydrogeologic conceptual model. I won't read the quote. I will read the second quote, though. That's a wrong conceptual model invariably leads to poor predictions, no matter how well a model is fit to the data. And that's from the USGS guidelines for evaluating groundwater flow models. What that means is that there's more than one way that a model can meet historical heads. And if it meets it with a wrong conceptual model, then it doesn't matter how closely it matches, it's not meaningful. Next slide, please. So this shows some data from the aerial electromagnetics work that was done in the nearshore area back in 2017, and the conceptual model that can be derived from that. In the upper two tiles, what you see is cross sections A prime and B prime, and they're shown in the center. They extend inland from the coast on the north side and the south side of the CEMEX property. And in the upper tiles, you see the hydrostratigraphic model that's derived from the AEM data. And then the lower two tiles, you see the water quality data that's derived from it. And starting, let's start with B prime, the mustard colored layer at the top, that's the dune sand aquifer. And then the purple discontinuous layer that you see going from left to right underneath it, that's the Salinas Valley aquitard. And what you notice immediately is that it's shown as being discontinuous in this conceptual model based on the AEM data. And then the mauve and teal are the upper and lower 180-foot aquifer, also a discontinuous aquitard there. The kind of gray blue is the 400-foot aquifer, which is also discontinuous. And then the brown is the 400-foot aquifer. So that's one of the key considerations there, is that the AEM data, which are an actual measurement of subsurface conditions, support that these aquifers are not continuous in this key area where the freshwater, where the basin meets the sea. And in terms of water quality, what we see is the cool colors. Those are correlated in Rosemary Knight's work with water concentrations less than 3,000 milligrams per liter. That's the blue. And then the orange is approaching seawater concentrations of TDS. And what you see is the fresh water coming in off of the dune sand aquifer, and coming into the 180-foot upper 180-foot aquifer, going inland on top of a diving seawater wedge with high salinity. Next slide, please. So these are cross sections that are parallel to the shore. C prime is right on the shoreline. D prime is just less than a mile inland. And what you see is at the shoreline, you see the same layers. You see that they're heterogeneous and discontinuous. And you see that the dune sand and upper 180-foot aquifer are seawater intruded at the shoreline. But then once you move inland, you start to see this freshwater lens building in to the upper 180-foot aquifer and the dune sand aquifer. And you also see that where there's the discontinuity in the 400-foot aquifer, you see downward movement there of the denser seawater. Next slide, please. So this is a cross section, kind of an oblique block section of the AEM data along B prime in that vicinity. And the lower left-hand corner is a conceptual drawing, cartoon drawing, if you will, of something showing known as the Geibben-Hertzberg relationship, which is it's a physics relationship basic to hydrogeology at seafronts that relates the interface that develops between freshwater and saltwater. It's shown in a simplified way in a homogeneous aquifer, but you can see that it's very similar to what we're seeing. So, and that results from if vertical flow can occur near the seashore, you will get an overriding freshwater lens, and you will get a diving seawater wedge. Now, that's been well documented, and Geibben-Hertzberg developed their theories about it late 1800s, early 1900s. Next slide, please. So this shows the same thing in a little bit more detail to explain it. So the basic physics behind it is that there's an equation that relates the depth to the freshwater seawater interface below mean sea level to the height of the freshwater above mean sea level and the ratio of the density between the two. And so basically the height of those heads near the shore is directly proportional to where that interface wants to occur. So you can think of it a little bit like an iceberg. And so a small change in HF, the height above mean sea level, results in a big change in the depth to the interface, or the inland position of that interface by proxy. And for normal seawater freshwater relationships, that's about a 1 to 40 proportion, so that, you know, a 5-foot change in head would cause a 200-foot change in the level of that interface. So all that to say, heads near the shore are very important to consider when you think of the intrusion of that dense seawater wedge and its behavior in the nearshore environment. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through my opinions. My opinion number one is that the Loeffler model incorporates the same regionally simplified hydrogeologic conceptual model as the SWIM. And because of that, I'm going to show you it's not a substantive improvement over the SWIM. And both models are subject to the same fundamental limitations. And I believe those limitations make them unsuitable for assessing the impacts of slant well pumping and in the nearshore environment. Next slide, please. So this is going back to, in the top two slides, the same cross sections AA prime and BB prime from the AEM data compared to model data that was extracted along those same transects from the Loeffler model. And what you see immediately is that the purple lines that represent the aquatards in the Loeffler model extend all the way from left to right unbroken. Whereas in the upper model, in the actual AEM data, they're discontinuous and more heterogeneous. And the implication of that is aquatards retard vertical flow. They impede it. If you want to look at vertical flow as a downward vector, every time that you cross an aquatard, you're slowing down that flow, usually by orders of magnitude. And it's the same principle on which putting a clay liner underneath a landfill is based. It will tend to stop vertical flow, including density-driven vertical flow. Next slide, please. So this shows a little bit of additional comparison. In the upper right-hand corner, again, is the AEM-based hydrostratigraphy. In the upper left-hand corner is that same section in the Loeffler model showing the continuous aquatards in kind of a layer cake fashion. In the lower right-hand corner is the AEM-derived water quality data. And in the lower left-hand corner is the water quality data derived from the Loeffler model. And the difference that you see in the water quality is that the Loeffler model shows horizontal flow. I would refer to it as plug flow. So basically, it's going through a horizontal conduit that has a wall on the top and on the bottom, and doesn't allow vertical flow to take place to a meaningful extent. Whereas in the lower right, what you see is the downward movement of the fresh water from the dune sand aquifer into the upper 180-foot aquifer, and you see the downward trend of the dense seawater wedge. And neither one of those two flows is allowed to occur based on the construction of the SWIM or the Loeffler model. Next slide, please. So this shows the results in terms of water quality data. The upper graph shows the water quality data in the dune sand aquifer. The lower shows water quality data in the 180-foot aquifer. And the dark boxes and lines are the observed data. The medium ones are from the SWIM model, and the light ones are from the Loeffler model. And so what you see is that in the nearshore area and the dune sand aquifer, both the swim and the Leffler model actually predict relatively fresh water that is not there. And that's because the water flowing seaward in the dune sand aquifer and the Leffler model has no place to go but out to sea on top of the Salinas Valley aquitard. And then in the 180-foot aquifer, what you see by contrast is that the model overpredicts the salinity, the TDS, by more than an order of magnitude by the time that you get to MW7M and MW5M. And what I'd point out for this opinion is that the Leffler model really doesn't improve on the swim model for being able to predict the salinities. Neither one of them do a good job. I'd say they both fail by an order up to an order of magnitude or more. Next slide, please. So this shows the heads, and again, this is just well, I actually have a couple of slides following this, but I'll just say here in terms of match or calibration, the match with at MW5S, which is located a little bit off transect, 3S, 4S, 7S, those are located right on transect, and 5S is a little bit off to the side. But you can see the inland, to the right, the wells are further inland. You don't get a good match for 5S, 7S, and 4S, and 3S, and from there on, you seem to get a good match, but if you look closely, the actual heads, you see a mounding near the coast that you don't see in the Leffler model, and that's important because it underlies the hydrogeologic conceptual model. In the lower right, what you see is that the Leffler model still underpredicts the heads and shows that bias of underprediction that the swim model had. It does do a little bit better, but it still has the same bias. And it predicts landward gradients that are about twice the gradients in the 180-foot aquifer. It does not predict the mound in the 180-foot aquifer. And it does not predict that between MW4M and MW5M in that area that the gradients really are relatively flat. They're relatively neutral. So it doesn't predict that. And that's a function of the underlying hydrogeologic conceptual model that prevents vertical flow from occurring. Next slide, please. Actually, I've already gone through these, so we can go to the next slide and then the next one. So opinion number 2 is related to the first one, which is basically as a consequence of this flawed hydrogeologic conceptual model, the Leffler model produces a biased and poorly calibrated result in terms of heads and gradients and water quality results. And so I don't believe that it's a suitable tool for analyzing potential impacts of pumping the slant wells. These factors are too important in the nearshore environment. Next slide, please. So these figures are taken from CalAm Exhibit 178, and they just show that, in the MW4M, MW7M, you can see that the green line, which is the Leffler model, is a little bit closer to the open dots, which are the actual head observations between 2015 and 2020, than the orange line, which is the swim model, but they still show the same bias to underprediction. Next slide. So I'm going to make a couple of points regarding this opinion by rebutting some testimony that Mr. Leffler provided. The first testimony that he provided that I'm going to rebut is that he says that the variable density model, when he turned on the variable density switch in his model and turned it off, it didn't make a difference. And therefore, he concluded that variable density is not important and makes no difference related to answering the questions that have been posed in this AHO proceeding. So regarding drawdown, extent of seawater intrusion, potential impacts to wells, and from slant well pumping. So my question is, since the Loeffler model impedes vertical flow, and by definition, variable density flow, that's what aquatards do, how can it be used to conclude that that vertical flow is not important? I would argue that it can't. It's a fundamental limitation of the model. It can't answer that question of whether or not variable density flow is important. Rather, when you see the AEM data, and you know that there's great salinity contrasts, and you know that vertical density flow, variable density flow will occur if given the opportunity through a discontinuous aquatard, this should be taken as a flag that the model is not able to predict something that's important or potentially important. Next slide, please. So this is shown in these two insets, which are, again, duplications of B prime of the model predicted TDS concentrations in the lower slides and the AEM interpreted salinities in the upper slides along AA prime and BB prime. And again, you see this plug flow going inland at a high rate, no mixing of the freshwater or freshwater lens in the upper 180-foot aquifer, and more rapid, concentrated, high concentration flow going inland in the 180-foot aquifer within these cross sections. Next slide. And in terms of water quality, we see that same thing, right? The water, fresh water in the dune sand aquifer has no place to go in the model except the coast, so it's under predicting the concentrations there by an order of magnitude or more, and the plug flow transports that seawater. Instead of a seawater wedge, it just moves it uniformly through the 180-foot aquifer and over predicts that salinity concentration by an order of magnitude. Next slide. Next point that I'd like to rebut is that Mr. Loeffler states that overall, while there are some problems with the SWIM model, historical simulations and calibration, it still provides very useful information regarding relative changes. And when you're using the model to evaluate relative changes, rather than absolute concentrations or heads, that it's still useful. And I would argue that since the SWIM and the Loeffler models share the same fundamental flaws, and they're not able to simulate variable density flow or the effects of protective heads and nearshore mounding of freshwater, that's not the case. So using the model and I understand that this has been discussed before, but a superposition modeling approach where in effect you subtract one baseline run from a simulated run and see what the difference is. To some extent, in theory, that can subtract out the mistakes or inaccuracies that are in both of those models, and they can be useful for looking at the change. But when the fundamental conceptual model of both is wrong, then the result of the differences is not meaningful. Next slide. The next comment is regarding the results of the supplemental modeling effort provide yet another data point that demonstrates the slant well pumping will have neutral to beneficial impacts. And I disagree with that statement. Since the Loeffler model simulates a flow system that doesn't actually appear to exist in the real world, where variable density flow and Geibin-Hertzberg dynamics are occurring, but they're not permitted to occur in the model, then it's not a meaningful data point. Next slide, please. This next rebuttal maybe sheds some light on why the model continues to have this hydrogeologic conceptual model. So in rebutting Dr. Kincaid's testimony that a reduction in heads of the near shore equates to harm to the MCWD wells, Mr. Loeffler says that that's a fundamentally flawed viewpoint, because the only thing that matters is changes in hydraulic gradients, and simply changes in heads of groundwater elevations are what matters. So in essence, what he's saying is variable density flow is not important to consider, and that's reflected in his model. Next slide, please. So opinion number 3, and that is that the Loeffler model produces estimates of ocean water percentage, or will produce estimates of ocean water percentage of groundwater extracted from the slant wells that are biased high. So in my opinion, it's not suitable as a tool for evaluating OWP. I don't think it provides useful perspective by virtue of the construction and the bias that it introduces. And that's for 3 reasons. One is the way that the model is constructed, it will simulate less freshwater capture than would actually occur. It would simulate more seawater capture than would actually occur. And then lastly, the model gradients, which are exaggerated inland, will bias the capture zone to capture more seawater and less freshwater than actually is captured. Next slide. So with respect to the first point, the Loeffler model simulates freshwater recharge through the dune sands and the swim also at a lower rate than I believe actually occurs. For perspective, Ms. Nelson provided some information. I'll provide some additional information that I learned during development of the GSP, which is that the stormwater management design standard, infiltration standard for the city of Marina in the dune sand area is 1 foot per hour. That's astronomical. And there's very little runoff that occurs from that area. So because it simulates less water flowing toward the shore and prevents it from flowing down into the 180-foot aquifer, there's simply less fresh water available in the model for the slant wells to capture, and that will bias the ocean water percentage high. Next slide, please. The next bias is over-predicting TDS concentrations in the 180-foot aquifer. So we've seen that this plug flow causes a higher concentration and less freshwater mixing and less freshwater presence in the upper 180-foot aquifer. So there is more salt water, higher concentration TDS water available for the slant wells to capture in the Loeffler model than actually exists in the real world. And that will bias the ocean water percentage high. Next slide, please. The last slide is regarding gradients. So we know that the magnitude and direction of ambient gradients, of the actual groundwater gradients before pumping occurs, has a direct effect on ocean water percentage. So basically the capture zone is directed in an opposite direction from the gradient. If there's a strong landward gradient, that capture zone is going to be oriented strongly out to sea. And we see from the water level data that we have that the Loeffler model overpredicts those landward gradients by at least a factor of 2, that it doesn't simulate the relatively level neutral gradients that exist between 2,500 feet and 10,000 feet inland. And it doesn't simulate the mounding that occurs at the shoreline, which, by the way, has to flow both ways. So there are seaward gradients even in the 180-foot aquifer, upper 180-foot aquifer at the shoreline where the water mounds. And the Loeffler model doesn't consider any of that, and as a result, overpredicts ocean water capture because of the orientation in the capture zone that creates. Based on an analysis by Weiss, where they looked at changes in gradients and their effect on ocean water percentage, I estimate that this may result in overprediction of the OWP by about 25% to the extent that neutral gradients exist inland. Now, I'm not saying that as an absolute, I'm saying that for perspective. Those are the bookends that Weiss gave us for neutral versus the actual gradients, and or versus steeper gradients. And so neutral gradients would be sorry, I'm getting myself lost here. Under neutral gradients, the ocean water percentage would be about 25% lower. And that's the end of my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Titsa.
Ms. Kenzie, excuse me. I wanted to clarify one of the exhibits that I had identified. I identified the rebuttal figures as exhibit 64. It's actually 65. I apologize for that, but I wanted to correct the record.
Thank you. All right, I don't have any, probably because of the end of the day that my brain is full, but I don't have any questions right now for you, Mr. Titsa, not because your testimony wasn't quite helpful. I will look to my team briefly. Mr. Wooldridge or Ms. Graziano, do you have any questions for Mr. Titsa at this time?
I do not.
Sounds like a no. We're all, we are all full of information. We are at 4:30. I hesitate to break up the witness's testimony. On the other hand, it would be better if we can avoid having to come back to add an additional hearing day. So here's what I'm going to say these thoughts. Yes, Mr. Osias, I hoped you would have some thoughts, but here are my thoughts for tomorrow, at least initially. One thing I can commit to doing is we could have a shorter lunch break. I could commit to a half-hour lunch break, which would get us half an hour. The other thing that's a possibility we could do is try to get through the witnesses, and then if we must meet again, we could schedule a time to go through the admission of exhibits and these kind of procedural matters where it wouldn't necessarily be required that all of the witnesses participate, and that might help us in our scheduling efforts. So those are two thoughts that I had. Mr. Osias, please go ahead and jump in.
Thank you. Besides being also full up with information and tired, I am now certain that cross-examination will not finish tomorrow. Much to my dismay.
Right.
Okay. So we will need an extra day. I think that extra day will include at least some of my cross, redirect, any other questions you might have.
Right.
And argument, which we're going to have now based on the testimony about some of these exhibits. So it's not going to be perfunctory admission. And I know how much I start over on that sentence. It is probably helpful to you, rather than hearing lawyers argue about what happened before, to actually gather together either orders, transcripts, or rulings on admissibility so that you can see them.
Right.
Or at least we can cite to them rather than my memory versus Mr. Bouchard's or Mr. Spalding's. Some of this testimony has problems like that. Okay. And I won't be able to actually get to the crux of that problem without doing some questioning. My optimism was ill-suited. So we should spend some time deciding if we're going to add a day, how long do we want to spend tomorrow? And how long do we want to spend on that new day, and when can we get it?
Thank you, Mr. Osias. So that's helpful. So what I would propose, if we are going to schedule another day, is then I retract it does seem to, I assume it's helpful for the attorneys too, to take an hour lunch. We're all working during that hour lunch. So I retract my statements. I think it makes sense to go from 9 to 4 tomorrow, including 1 hour for lunch. And then we're going to schedule another day. It seems inevitable. then the question is, which we may not be able to answer at this time, but we can return to it tomorrow, is whether there is a possibility of scheduling time. Obviously, I'd like to do it as soon as possible, but I don't know, the witnesses need to be available. So I would want to, in a perfect world, I would want to do it next week, not on Tuesday, because I have a board meeting that I'll be attending. So it would be Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. If we were able to do it next week, that may be completely impossible. I don't know. You've done amazing things in this proceeding before where you met on short notice. So I got to know what one member of my team is not available Wednesday. So I amend that to Thursday or Friday would be the better possibilities.
I support that proposal.
Okay. Well, we have one in favor of Thursday or Friday. I will,
I'm
Mr.
not,
Burchard.
yeah, I'm not sure that our witnesses are available next Thursday and Friday, but as soon as we're done here, I'll get together with everybody and try and confirm, but I'm
Yes.
almost positive that at least one of our witnesses is not available next week.
We need to, the whole week? I'm sorry.
I believe so, but again, like I said, I'll confirm. after
Okay.
the meeting.
If you would confirm, I mean, if as need be, we'll look out. It just is the way it is. Ms. Meisenheimer, did you have something to add?
No, I was just going to suggest that perhaps we confer offline and see if we can, we've got a lot of schedules to coordinate and propose some dates. And if the HO wishes to give us available dates, that's always certainly helpful, but you guys may need to confer as well.
Well, let me start with this. Let's, I think just based off the top of my head, I'm available and the team, I believe, is available Thursday and Friday of next week. That would be the 21st and 22nd. If this would be very short notice, but we could also be available on Monday, the 18th. I realize that's, that's a quick turnaround. And then I'm sorry.
I am in Colorado River meetings all day on Monday, the 18th. And
Okay.
sadly, I get to be Mikey in the old commercials where they let Mikey do it. So I sort of need to be here for the cross.
Right. No, that's, I understand. So not the 18th. And then looking to the following week, it appears that, at least to the best of my knowledge as an initial offer, that the team, the AHO team, can be available September 25th through 28th.
And I now sound like a problem, but the 25th is Yom Kippur.
Yes.
Not only will I not be available, but I won't even be eating.
You can't get through these hearings without eating. So let's eliminate the 25th as a possibility. But I will just put that out there, and then I thank you, Ms. Meisenheimer. If it's possible to confer offline with amongst yourselves, and then come back and we can discuss this again tomorrow, that would be quite helpful. But my goal would be to schedule one more day. Mr. Osias, I think it would be fair to hold you to 2 days in total. Although there may be, I realize the evidentiary, you don't know how long the evidentiary issues may go on, but
I took you at your word that, if something came up in the examination of, for example, Mr. Tizzi, who not only didn't do direct testimony, we didn't get any of his work until rebuttal. You at least allow me to probe, although I don't have a depot, so it's dangerous to do too much probing. But anyway, my goal is a day, with suitable breaks, and certainly not much longer. But you're right. I don't know what kind of argument I'm going to have with others.
Yes, thank you. So if you would confer amongst yourselves, and if we can come to some, if it's possible, or at least present what you have discussed to me tomorrow, we can talk about it then. That would be quite helpful, and I appreciate that. Before we break today, and I give you 20 minutes of your day back, is there anything else we should address? All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you once again for the witnesses who participated today. And thank you for all of your cooperation. And I will see you at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.